What is up, fellow sickos? I am Dan Favale coming at you with a very special NBA regular season debut podcast. While I was speaking with a local expert for each team, I asked each of them what was the biggest storyline they would be following throughout this coming season. I've put all of those answers together for the podcast that you are about to watch and or listen to. If you've checked out all 30 of our look ahead episodes, most of this won't be new for you. Some of it will be new. Grant and I specifically had to record the Timberwolves one. Kyle Teige's amazing, fantastic, but we recorded our Wolves look ahead before the Karl Anthony Towns, Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo trade. So bounce around. This will be time stamped. If you haven't checked out our look ahead series yet, where have you been? Have you not subscribed yet? Because you should hit that subscriber button on YouTube or go to Apple, Spotify and do it. And then I will love you forever, especially if you let me know that you're a new subscriber. Join our Discord as well. The link to that's in the podcast and YouTube description. There's still time to enter our over-under competition. The winner gets a merch item of their choice, and just as notably, the chance to guest host a mailbag episode. As I've said before, that's life-changing stuff. But this exercise was fun. I hope you enjoy the conversations I had with all of these guests who are smarter and more betterer than me at this. Had a great time talking to all of them. And just once more, each of those individual pods, with the exception of the Timberwolves one, and Grant and I recorded some updated thoughts after the trade, they will remain relevant, I would think, for at least the first 20-something games of the season as teams are kind of figuring things out. Trades will mostly date a lot of those thoughts, and we're probably not going to see a ton of those until December. With that, though, let's get to the biggest storyline for every NBA team during the 2024-2025 regular season. Aside from anything we've talked about, what is the biggest storyline for this team that you'll be monitoring throughout next season?
Yeah, I think there are there are a lot of storylines with this team. Obviously, it's how does Zachary Risachet adjust to the NBA? Is he able to sort of have the type of success that he was able to have at JL Borg in the EuroLeague? Is he able to kind of use his high basketball IQ to make some of the cuts to the basket that kind of drew the attention of a lot of scouts in the pre-draft process? Is he able to knock shots down from three? Can he stretch the floor? Is he able to add some strength to him? Because he is kind of I used the word lanky before. He is very lanky. He's definitely got a teenager's body. And so how he's able to do that, I'd love to see, the rise of Kobe Buffkin. He was injured a lot last season, missed a lot of his rookie year. So it would be interesting to see how he fits into the rotation, because when you look at sort of the projected, it's Trey, Dyson, DeAndre, Jalen, Clint as your starting five. It's likely going to be either Bogdan Bogdanovic or Onyeka Okongwu as the first off the bench. Probably go with Bogey just so that, you have that sort of minute or so for Trey to kind of sit about midway through the first quarter, and then he usually comes back toward the end, and then the other guard sits down. I kind of project Kobe would kind of be the backup point guard in that sort of rotation. It's just a matter of
so high on him,
right? Because they want to see the ball in his hands a bit more, and so that's kind of how I anticipate things going. Obviously, you have to have Zachary Risachet in there, but I would say he's probably like top 8, top 9 in the rotation. And then the next storyline is, of course, Clint, and he's on the final year of his contract. I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more, but like, do we finally see the rise of Onyeka Okongwu as, the guy who is the heir apparent for, should the Hawks decide not to re-sign Clint, which is very hard for me to see them doing, just because, again, we touched on it before, he's on the other side of 30, which is usually not a great thing for free agent centers. And so he has sort of been a guy that has taken slow starts to the season, and then it's like post All-Star break, he kind of like breaks out a little bit more, and then you see the old Clint that a lot of people were so used to seeing in Houston. And they're like, oh yeah, you really should be a starting center. You really earned that spot there. So I think those are the three big things. Obviously, how does Trae Young adjust to the new rotation? And if he, again, like we touched on, is he able to move off the ball a little bit more? And then, of course, how does the defense fare? Because that's just something that's not synonymous with the Hawks. It's in fact, it's like usually not the first thing you think about when it comes to the Hawks. So I think they've gotten better defensively just based on the pieces that they've added. But I'd love to see how the reality stacks up to what's on paper.
Looking at the actual next season, and I'm assuming I know the answer to this question, but what is the biggest storyline that you're kind of tracking for this team as they head into 2024, 2025?
It's the Porzingis injury, obviously. That's a massive one. I don't think enough has been made about it. They had a great record
until like 2020. Like, it is just like, oh, he'll be reevaluated in 6 months when that came out. That like puts him back at like the reevaluation like late December, right? And it just, you're right. It feels like it's not. I don't know if it's because their record without him last year was so good, but it feels like it hasn't been. Or I mean, they did win how many games did he play in during their playoff run? He was like
3 or 4.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. So that's a big one. They have the pieces to sustain it. I'd be much more worried about it if they didn't keep Tillman, which was the surprise of the summer. They were able to get him 2 years at the minimum. So I think he's going to be a major piece in how they sustain. Because Kornet, I'm the biggest Kornet fan going, but there are matchups where he can't play. So that you have a Tillman who basically has the opposite skill set of Kornet defensively, that's huge. And he needs to take some steps. I think his fit was a little awkward last year. He ended up having a big moment in the finals, but he's going to be crucial. You have options at that spot. I do wish Brissett was back in that mix a little bit too. He was a guy who could let you play a little smaller. But you got Anton Watson, who I actually think has a shot if what we saw in Summer League translates to maybe playing when they're super shorthanded. And then you have Horford at the point of attack, which is going to be the big one, right? Because I was looking last week. He played 30 minutes a game when Porzingis was out during the regular season. Obviously, he's going to play 30, 40 minutes in the playoffs with Porzingis out. But during this regular season, where you're probably trying to scale him back even more, not playing back-to-backs, you're going to have some situations where many situations where Porzingis and Horford are out, both of them. So how do you sustain in those situations? Do you have enough depth at that spot? Do some of the performances among those centers, the depth centers that surprised, I think across the board, even Cato last year was effective in his spots. Do those carry into this year? Or are you going to take a little bit of a step back in the regular season, and how much does that matter? And that goes to the second story I'm tracking, which is the hangover effect. How much of the commitment to the roles that we saw last year carries over to this year? Is there any relaxing? Is there any fatigue? I think that goes hand in hand with the Porzingis thing.
Because I monopolize so much of what we talk about on this podcast, I want to throw it to you first. What is the single biggest storyline for this team that you're going to be monitoring into and kind of throughout this next year?
I'll give you one general one, which is just, can we like maintain some good vibes and like positivity over a 12-month stretch? Do we think that's possible? Or do we think whatever ancient burial ground / affordable housing neighborhood Barclays Center was built on top of has made that an impossibility for this franchise? So that's number one.
The first year of the rebuild's kind of like a honeymoon period normally.
Yeah.
And they don't have, I think what also would help is I'm thinking on the roster right now, like they don't have anyone that's going to become a malcontent because they're so bad. Like Cam Johnson and DFS aren't those types of dudes. Ben Simmons doesn't have the cachet anymore for you to care if that's like where he ends up. So I would think that like this might be, I feel like this is going to be the year of the vibes in Brooklyn. Like I feel like the vibes will be good, even though the wins will be sparse.
Yeah, and it's going to be like a challenge for guys like Cam Thomas and Nick Claxton to like be like, okay, like year 4, year 5, like you guys are like leaders now, like you're the vets. You've been here for a while. We need you to kind of implement this culture under a new coach. So I think it's going to be cool to see those guys try to buy into that role. I mean, Cam Johnson and Dorian, we'll talk about it, but they're not here for the long haul in all likelihood. And then I said that was kind of general. Specifically, the Cam Thomas contract extension talks are, well, I guess not extension, but what they're going to do with him as his contract expires is going to become a big story for this team. Like for a third-year player last year, we heard absolutely nothing about a potential extension. Like they didn't talk at the end of last year. They didn't talk in the summer. They still have a couple more months to get it done, but it seems like both sides no, they're going to wait until the end of next season to negotiate. So I would say specifically that is what is going to emerge as a storyline for this team.
I have a ton of my own questions, and there's a chance your answer to this steps on the toes of those, that's the point. That would be in lockstep. But what is aside from the stuff you've just mentioned, what is the biggest storyline that you're monitoring with this team heading into 24-25?
How many games does LaMelo Ball play? It's that simple. If LaMelo Ball plays 50 to 75 games, this team is winning at minimum. You can put your money on the over, which I believe is 29.5 right now. So so at this point, if you tell me he's playing 50 to 75 games, then this team is going to win 30 games or more. If Mark Williams, who has not played more than 40 games, it's all about health.
Isn't it wild that those two have played? Yeah. I know Mark Williams has been in the league for 2 years. They've played 40 games together. That's not even a half season. That's
exactly.
Crazy.
Think about it like this. Mark Williams probably hasn't had a full offseason weight training program with the Charlotte and as a pro. Because last year he got hurt because of his thumb, and you can't really do any lifting on it with a bad thumb like that. You're talking about a dude that might be slightly underdeveloped, but if those two play 50 games, I think this team is going to be better than people think. I'm not saying playoff thing. I'm not saying they're Cleveland from a few years ago, but what I am saying is this team has been hindered a lot by health. And I do think that if they do get healthy, a lot of things are going to fix itself. And the vision that Mitch Kupchak had, but didn't have the finances to really pull off, I think that will be actualized at this point.
So where are you kind of at? You mentioned the defensive stuff, but where are you kind of at with LaMelo Ball? I think before his injury, finishing still not great, but he got to the rim. The driving part of his game had increased. He averaged 19 drives per 36 minutes last year, which is wild. But what else are you looking forward to see from him? Or just do you see him maybe improving his own shot selection in the ecosystem of a team that has more of a direction, more of a, I guess, an actual ecosystem or pecking order or hierarchy or talent around him in place?
Basically the thing is, Charles Lee is not the substitute teacher. There were times that you could tell that LaMelo Ball and others treated Steve Clifford as the substitute teacher in that locker room. And he tried to get the attention of everybody. He couldn't. And he lost the locker room clearly towards the end because you would hear a whole bunch of different things from Steve Clifford. I expect LaMelo Ball to be better in all facets I expect there to be a competent defender at some point. I expect the shot selection to get better. I expect I expect the drives to get better, quite honestly. I think there's going to be improvement. The question is, how healthy is he actually going to be? Because if he's not healthy, all of this is moot, and this team is probably hovering around 25, 27, maybe even 29 wins.
What did you make, and I'm sure you saw it, of there was this national discourse for a while. It did kind of peter out that maybe the Hornets should consider trading LaMelo so that they can reorient around Brandon Miller. And I want to put this for any Hornets fans listening and saying, oh, here we go, another national NBA podcast, bring up LaMelo trade stuff that doesn't exist. I did not ascribe to that idea. I don't actually even understand the genesis of it because I don't see redundancies in these players really at all. I think that they can complement each other quite nicely. So the fact that cropped up, did you make anything of it? I found it fascinating that it was even a discussion, I guess.
I'm not surprised it's a discussion. This is the same thing that we do. Unfortunately, the national media does this with a lot of the smaller max level guys. At the same point, I think it's maybe a year, 18 months too soon to start entertaining that. I think there's got to be a lot more stuff there. And despite the fact that you do hear rumblings on occasion that everyone, the Hornets are wanting to get out of the LaMelo Ball business, I put it this way. I wouldn't make any sort of intimations that he's done or they're going to trade him because it doesn't make sense. At this point, he is your draw card. Now, granted, Brandon Miller's come about and made it kind of interesting, but at the same point, we're talking about a guy when healthy that was a 20 point per game scorer and made things easy for quite literally everybody on the floor that he was with. And
6'7" point guard. Like, I just like those do not grow on trees.
You don't trade that unless you absolutely have to, or he basically says, yo, I'm not playing for you anymore. And by the way, he can't really do that anymore because the new CBA basically makes that virtually impossible unless you're willing to sacrifice millions and millions of dollars. So unless both sides really want out, I don't see the point in having this discussion unless they win 15 games. They win 15, 20 games again, maybe it becomes a conversation. And even then, most likely he's hurt and you're trading him for quite literally pennies on the dollar.
That's the thing, is that when you're outlining the 15 win scenario, it's probably because LaMelo isn't playing, and at that point his trade value is then nuked because he was injured again.
Exactly. And remember, this is the first year of his extension. So that's a $40 million contract that someone's going to have to eat and be willing to eat and be willing to rehab a whole lot of stuff. The biggest thing, like the ankle braces thing, was my biggest complaint about LaMelo Ball. That's gone now. Like it's clear he's got the ankle braces. It's clear he trusts this medical staff. So now there's going to be more of an attention on being a professional. He does that. He's untradeable at this point because, again, he takes care of his body. He becomes a professional. He's wearing the ankle braces. He's doing all this stuff. He's gonna play 50 games at minimum if he does that. And if he plays at minimum 50 games, he plays 60 games, he plays 65. We may see the return of All-Star LaMelo Ball if that happens.
If he hits the game's played threshold, I firmly believe, I tend to be higher on him than consensus, but like we're talking about an all-NBA caliber player here. I wouldn't guarantee it, but if he plays in 65 plus games, my guess is he will be in the conversation, even if it's on the periphery. And that is an incredibly difficult player to find.
Exactly. Like you don't trade those guys unless you're getting quite literally the Paul George package. Like that's what you get. Like that's what you trade them for. And there's no team that really has that outside of Utah and maybe Oklahoma City. Yeah. That really has it. And OKC doesn't need that guy. So
when you look at this team, then what is the storyline or whatever that you're going to be following, the biggest storyline you're going to be following most closely throughout the season?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that people will be tracking the draft pick. It's going to be a big one. Like, if you're like, I mean, they're rebuilding. They want to say, oh, they're not like rebuilding. You're rebuilding. Like, DeMar's gone. You're trying to trade Zach LaVine. You're trying to get rid of Nikola Vucevic, even though they're still here. Like, they clearly Zach doesn't want to be here. He hasn't wanted to be for a long time. Vuce is 34. He's on the decline. Like, those guys are going to be on their way out too. Like, they're rebuilding. So, like, losing a pick this year would be really hard to swallow. Like the only way that would be good is, so I guess this kind of plays into the other storyline. Are there the young guys they do have? Like, are they going to take a big leap? Is like Josh Giddey they're going to make him the starting point guard? Like, is he going to find his game again? Is Patrick Williams going to take the much awaited leap? Is Kobe White going to take another step forward after finishing second in most improved player voting? I would assume another good young player. Like, are those guys going to step forward and like, can they make the Bulls? Would they make the Bulls good enough to lose that pick? Like, if that happened, like you could maybe stomach like them if they were good enough to finish outside the top 10, maybe. And then of course, like the Vooch and Zach stuff will be something to follow all year too. Zach, again, we'll talk about those situations individually in a bit, but yeah, keeping the pick while developing young guys is basically story of the season for me.
Before we get into more of the granular aspects of this team, its upcoming season, what is the biggest single development storyline, whatever, that you're just looking at or going to be monitoring, not just heading into next season, but over the course of it?
You know, you bring on someone that covers the Cavs all the time, so they don't give the same answers that the national folks are going to do. But I think I've got to go default here and say the growth of Evan Mobley. I flat out think when you are building an offense around two smaller guards, you need to have a front court initiator for it to work, right? Like we saw that with Toronto when they won the championship with Fred VanVleet and Kyle Lowry playing major minutes together. You had that with Marc Gasol, right? And Kawhi Leonard was able to do some of that. You need to have a front court initiator to alleviate the pressure and allow those guards to not have to face, the traps and the crap that defenses can throw at them. So Evan Mobley developing as a secondary initiator for the offense and being that release valve and allowing Donovan and Darius to get easier looks off ball at times. I think that is what helps make their offense more multifaceted and gives them a chance to compete against the Bostons, New York, Philly, Milwaukee's of the world, because, the thing about them in the playoffs is their defense is held up. Their defense, their offense and defense was better against Boston than Dallas's was. Their defense with both guards and only one big has been elite in the regular season and the playoffs, right? Like so often people say you need to have Jared Allen and Evan Mobley to make Donovan and Darius work defensively. No, it worked really, really damn well with both guards and just one of the bigs, even in the playoffs. They outscored Boston with Darius and Donovan and Mobley on the court for the playoff series, right? Like the thing that hasn't translated, whether it's one big, whether it's two bigs, whether it's two guards, whether it's one guard, the offense has not translated to the playoffs. And I think getting Mobley to the point where he can help be that front court initiator to the offense gives them the best chance to make what's worked well in the regular season at times to something that can, be viable in the playoffs and give them a chance to compete.
Now, what needs to be done on Mobley's part? And I do think this eventually ties in the question of where you're at with the dual big setup for him to reach that level. I think the obvious low-hanging fruit, we saw a little bit of it when he came back from injury, is taking 3-pointers. He was almost at 2 a game from there, hit them in a nice clip, didn't necessarily hold up in the playoffs, but like to do what you're asking him to do, it seems like one, there needs to be more space, and he's going to be part of generating that space. But two, there's going to need to be other things like, can he tighten up his handle, and not just in space, but in traffic? But if you're looking at that role, or for him to actualize that ceiling, what's the one thing that you'll be monitoring then most closely about his development, like to make that happen, to him to fulfill that role?
Yeah, I mean, if I can pick one thing, it would be the handle. Like I want the handle to improve, because I think that would help him be a more consistent initiator of the offense. I think that would help him be a threat and be able to put rim pressure on. My favorite stat is Evan Mobley last year, despite missing, a good chunk of the season with that surgery, he made more threes last season than Bam Adebayo's made in his career and Zion Williamson has made in their careers. Like, they don't get talked about in that way, right? Like Bam, he hit some threes with a shorter line in FIBA competition, and it's, oh my God, is this the year of stretch 5 Bam, right? And we're putting Kel Ware here to play the 5, and Bam's moving over to the 4, right? Like, he's 5 years older than Evan Mobley, and Mobley's made more threes last season than Bam has in his career. Like, I would like to see the volume go up, right? He shot 37% last year. I'd like to see that tick up to 3 attempts per game. I think that's where I would feel comfortable, but I don't want to see him taking more than that. What I want to see is him, being able to put that rim pressure on, being able to handle the ball, bringing it up in transition and helping them up their pace. Like, that's the kind of stuff that can help unstick the offense. And you don't hear Pelicans folks talk about, we need a stretch 5 to work around Zion, right? Or because we have Herb Jones out there who shoots like Isaac Okoro and gets ignored at the exact same rate. And we have Jonas who takes 1 3 a game, although he's gone to Washington. Like, you don't hear that, but you don't hear that because Zion is able to negate that spacing issue by his ability to create. So I think I want to see that from Evan Mobley more than anything else. And like, if I could, gift him with the one skill or one thing from, the summer workout videos to have translated, it's definitely that.
I also wonder too, with those two specifically, I actually do think Pelicans I guess they want any sort of 5 on the team right now, but I do think that there was kind of, there was kind of
Wendell Carter Jr. not on there. Sorry to get sidetracked.
But with Zion and Bam, they can score as a play finisher in such like a physical way that, and even Zion on the ball, like he's not your traditional big. And I wonder if Evan Mobley, I think he's gotten better at that, but like that was also a concern about how he's going to deal with contact and physicality. So even if he, as a play finisher, felt like more of a physical presence, I wonder if the discourse around him would be different. I also think he probably just set like the bar too high for himself. Where he was my defensive player of the year pick, not this past season, obviously, but the one before.
Yeah.
And then just he sets the bar so high through his first like year, and then the Cavs are quote unquote on this accelerated timeline because of the Donovan Mitchell trade. I do wonder how that's also impacted how people view him too.
Yeah, and to give him some credit too, I think they're on an accelerated timeline because of Evan Mobley, right? Like they were a lottery team, and drafting Evan Mobley immediately made them a elite defense, right? And once you have that end of the floor figured out, you can make a move for Donovan Mitchell, right? Like, so I think, his growth has kind of helped accelerate that timeline as well. So, but he's definitely a victim of that to some extent. But you look at it from a per 36 possession kind of standpoint, he's averaging career highs in everything, right? Like his minutes came down just when he was on minute restriction, but like points, field goal percentage, 3-point percentage, defensive metrics, all that kind of stuff, efficiency, it was all career highs. I just think, he's just got to round out his game and do things that he's already shown at a higher frequency, right? Like he shot better from mid-range last year. I think that's one of the big differentiations between he and Bam is that kind of credible threat to shoot from the free throw line at all times. You can run an offense and have him as that hub at the nail, and you have to respect his jumper from that spot. If Mobley can do that, I think that opens up a wide variety of options, and it makes easier to have Allen in the dunker spot and run some actions with the guards and whatnot. So I think what he needs to do isn't something that he's never shown, right? Like he's shown it in spurts. He'll hit those shots. I forget which team he hit the game-winning mid-range shot against. He's hit some big threes coming down in the clutch in the fourth quarter and stuff like that. He's just got to do it consistently and at a higher volume.
I guess the two concerns I would have though is, so Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland can play fantastic, like they work off the ball, like defenses need to respect them. But we also kind of, you've talked about it a couple times about the concern about moving Darius Garland off the ball too much to where it sort of disinvolves him.
Yeah.
And so is the opportunity going to be there for Evan Mobley to explore like the depths of like getting to that point with like him as an individual ceiling, of course, but then also if you're trying to maximize his time alongside Jared Allen, like, is there going to be sort of enough reps to go around there it's not a matter of Donovan. I want to make clear to anyone listening, it's not a matter of Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland can't. It's how much do you want to invest in moving them away from the ball to kind of help facilitate the optimal version of Evan Mobley?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And, you also have to factor in the growth that Jared Allen showed last year, right? Like I thought, it was the best season of his career, and he was passing like really well the short roll, and he was someone that you could initiate offense through at times. Like, it's a good problem to have, but it is a problem to have at times. And, I think what he's going to need to do within that starting lineup is going to be different than, over the course of the game. Like I think if he's taking 3 threes a game, I want those threes to occur when Jared Allen is on the court, right? Like when Jared Allen is not on the court, I want to see, let's run some more offense through him, right? Like I think, historically, the funny thing to look at is when you look at the 2 years worth of lineup data, Evan Mobley and Donovan Mitchell as a pairing without Garland and Allen does not work. Their net rating is, about where the Brooklyn Nets were last season. But him and Darius work incredibly well. Donovan and Jared work incredibly well. Darius and Jared did not work really well. So I think that's a really interesting dynamic. But ultimately, like those guys will play 18 minutes together per game. That's typically where you're at. You do still have kind of 30 minutes to explore the space where it's going to be one guard and it's going to be one big out there. It will be interesting to see, though, what happens in closing minutes, right? And maybe this is one of the benefits of having Jared on a value contract, right? Like that deal apparently is supposed to be like 15-16% of the cap once those cap numbers come in, like 15-16%, like we're talking about Max Strus money, like
Right,
in terms of, percentage of the cap. If you need to play him 28 minutes in a game rather than 34, that is something that you can do, and like you're not kind of handcuffed to make those decisions. But I think if we want to look at the best version of what this Cavs roster can be, it's maximizing those minutes when all four of them are out there together. 22-23, they did that. They were tremendous. You look at the last 41 games of that season, and Darius was getting 22 and 8. Mobley was getting his 18 and 10. Jared was getting his 15 and 10. Donovan was getting his like 28 and 4 or whatever he was getting, right? Like all four of them were eating and they were playing well alongside one another. But I think making it so that there's the buy-in to the system, that the minutes together are maximized, the minutes apart are maximized, where it's not as, stark of, okay, well, what are these pairings? Like figuring out how to make Donovan and Mobley work, figuring out how to get, Darius and J.A. back on the same page, like they were in the All-Star season. Like, I think all of that stuff is going to be kind of one of those interesting things to track with this coaching staff.
My final concern with it would be that there's a chance Evan Mobley does all these things and the Cavs play it perfectly. And it, to some extent, may not matter because, and I'm not comparing him to this player, but we saw it in OKC when Josh Giddey was actually taking and hitting threes and defenses still didn't care because it was never enough at a clip. So it still made OKC Thunder when he was on the floor with some of these other guys a lot easier to defend. And so I'm going to be very interested to track that dynamic. But my own answer to my own concern has been, you mentioned that first season, they were in the 96th percentile of offensive efficiency with all four of those guys on the court. And I think three of their three top used lineups all included a fifth member of the rotation that was a below average shooter, you would call them. It was Isaac Okoro at the time, Karis LeVert. I think that might have been the Lamar Stevens year. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And so that's
Lamar was the only one that it didn't work, I believe.
And so like, that's what I continue to latch on to is like, okay, well, even if it's like if Evan Mobley, if that version of Evan Mobley's hitting threes and defenses, they're going to have to respect him a little bit more so they can play off and say, we're fine with his 3 attempts per game. And he can make 2 of them and we're just not going to care every time. But I point back to that season where we just had this extended sample. I would call it at full strength. It was worse circumstances when you look at the supporting cast. So I almost don't understand how this isn't going to work now if everybody's healthy. So it's like, I have concerns, but I'm like, well, just let's go look at the first season when they had less experience and less talent like together. So that's where I'm at.
And that goes back to what I was saying before about if you're going to build a contending team without a consensus top 10 player, where it's just inarguable that you had this superstar LeBron James level talent, you don't bridge that gap by trading all-star level talent for role players that just, fit an archetype, like a big wing, like let's move Jared Allen for Cam Johnson. Okay, well, like now you have a big wing, but like you're getting worse from a talent perspective, right? Like, or, as much as I love Brian Windhorst, like the fact that he is so adamant that Donovan Mitchell can be the only ball handler on the team. And we got to run a heliocentric offense with spot up guys and one big around Donovan Mitchell. Like, that never works. Like Dallas learned that lesson and got Kyrie for Luka, right? Like, like that, like Donovan Mitchell playing Russell Westbrook martyr ball is not going to bridge the gap, right? Like this is not what needs to be done here. We're like, we have to get all-star level talent. We need to maximize all of this talent. I don't think Donovan's as good of a playmaker as Russ was, and it didn't work with Russ, right? Like, I share some of your concerns for sure. I think if Mobley is, taking 3 threes a game at the same percentage he did last year, 37%, I agree with you. I don't think people are like sprinting out to the 3-point line to go guard him. But I think him being a viable threat there is at least important, because if he's out there and he gets the ball and you're completely sagging off of him, all right, I'm just going to do a little dribble handoff to Garland or Mitchell. I'm going to take this shot myself and I'll convert some of these. But I think the handle, that's where it becomes so important, because if you're giving a 7-footer that's added strength, that finishes well historically around the rim, that has a good floater, good touch from that mid range, if you're giving him a head start and you're flat-footed as a defender sitting in the paint, you are going to get exposed. You are not, that's why people come out at Giannis. They don't want to give him that running start, even though he can't shoot from 3, right? Like, so that's why I think that is so important. And, I think guys that shoot well, but at a low volume. I think that's more of a concern at the perimeter than it is for a power forward or a center, right? Like I think that's just a different equation. And that's where we run into someone like Isaac Okoro, who shot 39% from three, but because the volume isn't there, guys are going to leave him wide open. I think he took 2 threes with a defender within 6 feet last year. And, you know, to go back to the Pelicans example, exact same thing happened to Herb Jones. I think he shot 40%, but did not have a single contested three in the playoffs because people are like, well, if you're going to shoot 40%, but you're taking 3 threes, like worst case scenario, you hit 1 or 2 here. Like we can live with that in order to pack the paint and take away, you know, more consistent threats like a Zion Williamson.
I think it's interesting. I would say definitely when he's at the 5, like I don't think it matters. I still think we're at the point where if it's from the 4 spot, I still think you could see some of the like similar ill effects there of that.
Oh, for sure. I just think, you know, you can mitigate some of that by improving the handle. It would be my argument.
But when you look at someone like Klay Thompson, what do you make of his overall fit? Like, do you think this signals maybe a shift of what some of the stuff the Mavs are going to do offensively? Do you at least trust that he'll buy into a more limited role? Because if you go back to what was happening in Golden State, like he had a pretty shitty shot selection towards the end of his time there. I felt like he was struggling to just adapt to his new role, the role they wanted him to play. Is that just easier by virtue of the ball dominance in Dallas from Luka and Kyrie, or just it being a new environment? Just what do you sort of make of that fit specifically?
Well, I think that the Mavericks needed another guy who could actively dribble. Dante Exum filled the role for parts of the year, but I just get the sense that Jason Kidd doesn't trust him. Klay Thompson can handle the ball and can pass the ball. And, you know, there's Jared Dubin of Last Night in Basketball put together a really good compilation of Klay's passing to Golden State bigs. And with all due respect to Golden State bigs, they're not Derek Lively. So I can't wait to see him in some pick and roll action and doing some different things. I think, you know, I think the Mavericks are trying to do things that will get the ball out of Luka's hands in different playmakers' hands to where he just doesn't need to have a 36% usage rate, to where he can have a 32% usage rate. And like, we're talking like 3 possessions a game. We're not talking about that much stuff, but I think that Klay will find a way to get his shots. One of the things that is woefully misunderstood about Luka from people who think he is a ball hog, they don't get that he wants to make the pass. He loves the highlight pass way more than the circus shot. And right now, if you're just talking about the Mavericks in a, you know, broad situation, if Klay's starting with Kyrie Irving, PJ Washington, Luka Doncic, Derek Lively, the guy you have to sag off on right now is PJ Washington, who ended up punishing the Oklahoma City Thunder. And so it's like and then they've only added more shooting here. So it's like on paper, and particularly in a regular season game where teams aren't really scouting things to the nails, the Mavericks just are going to have the ability to score the ball a lot of different ways. And so I think Klay's shots will be there. It wouldn't shock me if he waxes and wanes. I mean, he's played a lot the last 2 years. I think the average fan doesn't really understand that he came back from that 2-year break, injury break, and ended up playing quite a lot of basketball. So he'll still play a lot this year. He'll have his opportunities. I'm a little worried about role stuff, but not because he's going to be a fourth banana, because I think he kind of already was. It's more of a how does Kidd work with him, because I don't think Klay Thompson was responding to Kerr anymore, and I'm curious to see how that will work out.
I also do think that just being in like a new environment and having to be the new guy probably helps him, where I've mentioned this before on this podcast anyway, that seeing Draymond Green and Steph Curry not really shrink in importance in Golden State when you came up with those guys, won 4 titles with those guys, was probably just like tougher to stomach and reconcile. So I feel like it'll be smoother. The one thing I would be curious though, and this isn't an insult to him, he's older, he's had those 2 major injuries, he's just not even close to what he was defensively. And so if we assume that he's going to start and at least play like starter level minutes or close to it, do you think when he's playing with Kyrie and Luka that the Mavs have enough defensively to insulate him and to optimize that lineup?
No.
Okay.
And that's where the kind of mad scientist element of a regular season comes into play, where we see what Kidd tries. I think if you bank in for both Luka and Kyrie, both of them missing 15 games each, I think we'll see a lot of lineups where Klay Thompson is like the second best scorer on the floor, which does allow Dallas to play a Najee Marshall, a Quentin Grimes, and really try to basically patchwork the defense together. I do think they're going to have to, they're just going to have to ask Klay to guard more. And I'm going to be curious to see how, he really hasn't shown it the last 2 years, but the Warriors were also not very good. And there's elements of, for me, if the situation is different, and are the Mavericks able to cover different things with him schematically? I'm curious. Like, he's not the defender that made him one of the 75 best players ever. Like, that's something that Mavericks fans are going to have to come with. But one thing is true: he's still 6'7", and if you're putting out a line where Kyrie is the smallest guy, or even like say you exchange Kyrie with Grimes for periods, like the Mavericks have a big team.
Yeah, they're huge. They're huge.
There's something to be said just for guys taking up space.
Yeah.
And that's not obviously NBA level defense, but against, the 20 of the 30 NBA teams, you can sometimes get away with things like that.
I've been asking everyone what their biggest storyline is that they're tracking for the specific team, but for the Nuggets, and I would love it if you have a different opinion on this, but we're going to talk about it either way. Is it just like the development of the three core youngsters at this point is particularly viewed against the backdrop of KCP leaving?
So I actually think that might be third for me. So it's really important, and I understand, and this is probably a semantic answer, but number one to me is Jamal Murray. Even last year, Denver was winning at a 62 win pace when Jokic and Murray played. The truth is, we just don't know how many games he's going to miss. He missed 23 last year. No matter what, Denver won 57 games, a franchise record, and their second best player missed 23 games. So I look at this and I go, I think Denver is actually better than what we all were very, very high on him. I think we were appropriately high on them last year. You get an injury to your second best player, he misses a ton of time, and the team runs out of gas, and they end up coming up short in the playoffs. But I think that on March 10th, out of the All-Star break, they're on a big win streak. I was like, they are the favorite to win the title, and they might have another 16-4 run in them. They were playing at that level. To me, all these other things are important margins and kind of big margins, but Jamal Murray's health, motivation, conditioning, and consistency to me are by far more important than all the other variables for Denver. So to me, that's number one. And to be honest with you, I have no idea what to expect from Jamal. Is he going to play? He's always been bad in October and November. Is he going to be good this year in ways that are meaningful? And this is look, his stock is at an all-time low, and I have to think that he hears all the noise. He also ended last year, if you recall, by throwing a heat pack onto the floor. I think his reputation, not only in how he plays, but I think also to some extent his character is in question in ways that I hope and I would expect him to say, okay, I need to remind people this year, because at the moment there's valid arguments that I am the guy the haters think I am and not who I think I am.
He's might be just one of the players that have explored the most extreme peaks and valleys. And this past year or 18 months, whatever, it might be a perfect example where I was being asked to go on podcasts, radio shows last year after they won the title. Is Jamal Murray a top 15 player was the question. Yeah. And now it's oh man, should the Nuggets even pay this guy? It's only been a
so
year.
I think ESPN had him 17th last year in the player rank, really, really high. All, coming off of that incredible finals. I'm so curious to see where ESPN has him this year. I'm guessing it's 40th, somewhere around there. And it's crazy, right? That he should be ascending as a player, not dropping that far.
So looking at this actual team and what may play out on the court in this forthcoming season, what is just the biggest storyline that you personally are going to be monitoring throughout the year?
Yeah. So this one's pretty obvious. It's Cade. How good does Cade look with the roster more suited to his talents, right? Because we've complained about it. And even through all the complaining, he was a lot better last year. He was a 24-5 and 7.5 guy. He shot 39.5% from three after the All-Star break. Those are
backs for falling. You love to see it.
Those were very good numbers, and they coincided with just adding Simone Fontecchio and not much else. And getting rid of the Killian Hayeses and Isaiah Liverses of the team, who are just not real NBA players, right? And so with less of a phone booth, with better talent around him, with other guys who might be able to make some shots around him, could he be a 26-5-9 guy? like that's kind of an all-star. Like Tyrese Maxey was an all-star last year, and he was a 26, 4, and 6 guy, right? And so it's like, if Cade can get to that level of production and the team can find some level of success on the court, some amount of wins, not lose 25 plus games in a row. It's like you have a narrative around like the team building something, Cade being a large part of that, and him being acknowledged kind of in the media, in the national media, and like by his peers as like a guy who's like willing, who's been able to do like the things for them.
Why do you think you just said something that made me think of it. Why do you think that there seems to be so much division over him? Is it because, okay, so we have this track record of injuries, and then last year everyone kind of latched on to the turnover issue, which got better. But like, if you weren't watching, and I guess this amounts to me being condescending, I hate playing if you weren't watching the Pistons card, but it seems like even with players who are more established, something might happen in the first like 10, 15 games, quarter of the season. And like, that's the storyline that defines the rest of their year, almost regardless of what is actually happening. What do you think makes him such a divisive figure in I guess it's would you build around this player discourse, basically?
Yeah, I think it's the fact that nothing about him is really like, he doesn't stand out in any like one area of the game, right? He's not he's a really good passer. He's made himself more of a shooter over the last season, but before that he was really inefficient and he turned the ball over a lot, didn't really get to the rim, never shot any free throws. And so again, like, if you were only turning the Pistons on like during the 28 game losing streak, which I think was still like before Christmas, it's like, okay, like this team's going nowhere. This guy's like not able to elevate them. And so it's like, we can kind of write him off. But I think the team was so bad last year. There were just so many non-functional NBA players around him. And the skill set that he has was just like not, because he's not a guy who's going to go out and score 40. It was like, because he's a guy who wants to kind of play slower and kind of dissect defenses. I think that like he wasn't able to lead the team to wins, and people just kind of took that in a poor way, as a poor reflection of himself. Like, you look at like Paulo Banchero was like equally as inefficient, but like slightly more productive, but his team was winning, and he got a lot of credit for that. He gets a lot of kudos for that. I think team success will lead to people viewing Cade in a more favorable light, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. What does the next frontier for him look like? You mentioned sort of the rim stuff, and I'd mentioned in the notes, it sometimes feel like he might have that extra gear, like let's flip the dial and get a little bit faster rather than, relying on, I don't know, hesitations or like bailing out too early on his drives. And he does still, maybe the lower body injuries have impacted it, but like you've seen him turn corners sometimes and like get by people. And if he did that more consistently, is that a spacing thing? Maybe now that it'll be better around him, he could get there, or is it just something else entirely that you're looking at for his development?
No, I'm looking at rim finishing, but I'm looking at him adding strength, right? The thing that really stood out to me last season was as he got stronger and as he got better, using his body to carve out space, you could really see that there were times where you were reminded, like, oh yeah, he's 6'6", and like he can extension finish around bigs, or if he gets into the paint with no help, like he can finish over and around guys. It's still below the rim, right? But he can still do that. Like, stylistically, he does still love those mid-range jumpers, and he's very good at them. But you do wish some of those were like paint touches and kickouts. I wish some of those were like 10-foot floaters instead of 15-foot like pump fake shot. But I do think that he will always kind of be who he is. He'll always be a change of pace operator. That's how he wants to play. But like, Dan, you watch Jalen Brunson, right? Like Jalen Brunson would just like pick people apart from like inside 12 feet. And like, as long as you get into the paint and pressure the defense, like you can figure stuff out from there. I think Cade like absolutely has the potential to do that. And that will be the thing I'm looking for him to do this season.
You mentioned someone with his size and Jalen Brunson's like footwork. That's a nasty basketball player.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is too, like as the roster gets better, like we talk about the spacing being something good for him, obviously, but with the spacing being better and with his teammates being able to hit more shots, he'll be able to distribute a lot more. And I think his distribution is something that doesn't get enough play because his teammates like don't hit enough shots, right? He's a guy.
I think he's a really, really good passer, and maybe some of it's like
really good passer.
Like he
When
just
he's
the
not passing
size and the
to
ability
his-
to see things. And so I am very anxious to see, not anxious, excited to see what he could do with what I assume will be better spacing. But Grant, what's the single biggest storyline you're going to be tracking for the team this season?
I mean, isn't that a hard question though? Like, so the one I've kind of trotted out a lot and we've talked about is the emergence of, or potential lack of, like a second star guy to lighten the load on Steph as he enters his age 36 season. And just looking at the roster, actually, I should couch this in, having watched the preseason, there are a lot of takeaways, I think, that are interesting and kind of change a lot of what I thought prior to the preseason. That's a stupid position to take because the preseason doesn't matter, but the team is pretty different. I still think, though, sort of you can't not say it's this angle is who's going to be that guy. And it's like, well, because Clay really wasn't last year, and he's gone, obviously, but it's like, and you're never going to get a Durant caliber second guy again, because that's just, just a total, all the planets aligned for that one. But someone who emerges, whether that's a young guy that takes a step forward or someone that they may try to trade for, and we can talk about how close or not close some of those efforts were. But I think that's it. And it does that angle does kind of bleed into some other ones that are interesting to me that we can discuss. But I just feel like you can't pretend like it's something other than that. You could say like Steph Curry's health, but it's like, well, then that's true of the best player on every team you're going to do a look ahead for.
And he's not on the Joel Embiid level anymore, where that's the day-to-day storyline. So it's a little different.
It's more like, I mean, it is a little different, I guess, in that like age 36 season for a guard is like the expectation should be like massive drop off. The fact that it's been really gradual over the last 3 to 5 years is, that can't be the focal point. And if it is, it's like a short conversation, because it's like, well, he'll either get a little bit worse or a lot worse, and then that's okay. So then what? Like, that's not really, that I guess underscores the importance of somebody else emerging as like a high usage, shot creator, playmaker, scorer.
I don't know if this would be like the actual biggest storyline, but this player does feel like he will shape what is going to be the biggest storyline or how they approach the season. That is Jonathan Kuminga. Mm-hmm. And much of the preseason, the lead, like training camp, and the lead up to the regular season has been spent just everyone openly wondering or opining about which position he needs to play. Is it the 3 or the 4? Can he play the 3 on this team? Should they've had a stretch big on this team if they wanted him to play the 3? Where do you sort of land on that entire overarching discussion?
Specifically, like what position he should play?
Yeah. Well, I mean, or what position? I mean, let's say there is a stretch big on this team. Mm-hmm. Do you think that he can then play the 3, or do you view him more strictly as a 4?
So personally, I know that distinction has been drawn really clearly. Like Kuminga thinks he's a 3. I think he's basically said that explicitly. Maybe the Warriors think he's a 4. That has definitely been said explicitly. And the lineup, the data from last year it's like over 90% of his minutes he was designated as the 4. So there is a disconnect there. In my opinion, I don't think it matters that much. I think the 3 and the 4 are kind of like whatever. Now it's different on this team because whether Draymond Green is the 4 or the 5 makes a huge difference in sort of how the lineups look. So if Draymond is the 4 and you're playing him with a center, then Kuminga is a 3. I just think like his skill set kind of works either way. And like the things he's good at and not good at don't really change depending on which of the forward positions he's occupying. To me, I think the reason that question is interesting and kind of tricky to figure out is what it means for the rest of the lineup, which is kind of what you're getting at, I think. So like, I guess my answer would be if Kuminga is going to shoot with as little hesitation from 3 as he has in the preseason, especially on just catch and shoot stuff, then I think it's a lot easier for me to imagine getting away with him as a 3 without a stretch center. Just because that, it's like, oh, we need to accommodate him with spacing at other positions to make that work. It's like, well, if he's providing the spacing by being a pretty high volume threat on the catch, then I think that mitigates some of that issue. So like, I know it's almost too hard to talk about it in terms of just like what position is he or what should he play, because you have to just rejigger so many different things in the rest of the lineup potentially. And then ultimately, again, it may not matter, because if he's going to shoot a bunch of threes, then I think that just opens up your options a little bit more, which I think, as we'll talk about, that is almost a problem with this roster, because there are too many options. There's too many guys that need to play or that should play, and it just makes all the lineup decisions hard.
I know he's been getting them up in the preseason. He's been hitting them. I'd just be curious, if he's taking them, how long does it take for defenses to change the way that they're going to guard him? Because even if he's shooting, let's say 45% on 3 to 4 catch and shoot 3-point attempts per game, okay, if that's not getting defenses to come out to him, that makes life harder on everybody else, which I guess gets into the Draymond Green and are they playing him with TJD or Kevon Looney, or it doesn't really matter. And to me, as of right now, I guess I'll phrase it this way. When I look at this roster, it feels like the best way to optimize it in general with what Kuminga does and doesn't do versus the personnel that they have would be that Draymond at the 5 has to become more of a staple, which is something I know Draymond doesn't like. I know the Warriors haven't liked it. And I understand, especially now as he gets older and kind of the rigors that are associated with it. And so I'm just curious, is like, is that what's going to become a potential default? Or we saw them, I think it was it Wednesday night? They rolled out the jumbo lineup. Didn't they have Wiggins was basically the 2 with Kuminga starting at the 3? It's like I guess you see a pathway to this setup working where I don't need to get caught up in the positions of it all, but you see a pathway to them being able to play Kuminga, Draymond, and a big. And then if you do see that, do you actually see, okay, can you also add Andrew Wiggins plausibly into that fold?
Yeah, I think that's the reason they tried that look the other night. There have been different starting lineups and different rotations in each preseason game so far. And that is just because the coaching staff is trying to figure out, like, what do we do with all these guys that need to play?
Do you get mad at all about that, where they're changing? I've seen a lot of fans get annoyed by like the lineups that are being run out there. And I guess if this spills into the season and it's not working, okay, sure. But if you're not going to try it now, would you prefer that they try it when the games matter?
Not mad at all. Not mad. I think it's the only way. It's the most logical way to approach the preseason, because like they just don't know. They can't know. They added 3 guys that are theoretically rotation players. They've got all these young guys, not all, they've got several young guys that, need to get looks. And so it's just like, it would be weirder to me if they had gone with a starting 5 for all of the same one for all the preseason games and just like decided that was the look, because I don't think they know that yet. So the small ball thing with Draymond at center, if you'd asked me a month ago, and I wrote about this, and I think we probably talked about it, like that makes the most sense to me. Whether he likes it or not, whether the Warriors are comfortable using it as like a first option as opposed to oh shit, we're down 2-1 in a playoff series, we gotta go to the death lineup or whatever. Just because that's how you get Kuminga and Wiggins on the floor together. That's how you get more athletic. And their two best high usage lineups last year were involving Green at center and Kuminga and Wiggins. The difference was, is it Podziemski or Klay Thompson at the 2? And Steph obviously is the 1. So like those were their best lineups in terms of units that played over 300 possessions, which like that's not a lot, but that's the biggest samples they had of any 5-man units. So I was on board with that's the way you go. You got to start the season that way, because your margin for error is smaller. Your superstar talent is diminished. You can't like hold it in reserve. If you want to make the playoffs, you're going to need to start with your best weapons. Now, though, because of the style they're apparently going to play, which is shoot a billion threes and move the ball a ton, I think you could get away with more quote unquote conventional looks where Draymond is a 4, and it's probably Jackson Davis at the 5, I would guess, over Kevon Looney, just because I just think Jackson Davis brings more athleticism, shot blocking, like that kind of stuff, more dynamic play. And Looney can handle being benched, I think, more so than a lot of the other guys. But I'm more open to, okay, maybe we do have like a real center out there, and just see if we get enough shooting from guys that we probably in the past would not have counted on getting enough shooting from.
I do think most people are going to focus on Kuminga shooting as kind of the arena where they want to see him improve the most or will track most closely. What's another area of his development, though, that you're going to be monitoring this season?
Defensive awareness. That has stood out immediately to me in the preseason. It's been an issue all along where, he'll lose. It's all the basics. Like he'll lose track of his guy. He'll give up open threes at the wrong times. He won't rotate over. There are just long stretches where he's not mentally engaged to the level that he would need to be on defense. And I think that's why they like to use him against more dangerous on-ball threats, because it allows him to just be focused on more of a singular task as opposed to processing all the other stuff that's going on where you're in help position. But that's a big one, because with a guy like him who can just, the way he moves is, he's an A+ athlete, even among NBA players. I've said it, it's obvious. For him to be a liability a lot of the time on defense is kind of inexcusable, because it is focus. It is like just understanding what the scheme is and like who you can and can't leave and like that kind of stuff. So the shooting, honestly, as a catch and shoot guy, I think he's going to be fine. Like I don't know if you're going to get a lot of pull up threes, but I don't know that you need those. It's really now, to me, the defense is the biggest part of it, because it's just not as good as it should be, I think, in my opinion.
I think I'm curious to see what if his driving game can evolve to maybe include more facilitation out of it, to where we know he's not the most adept passer, but when you're talking about kind of kicking or like just these dump offs when you're on the move, they could be harder. But the way that he handled the ball on drives for a lot of last year, I thought was a lot better when you go back to like even the previous seasons. The handle felt tighter, crisper. Do you see that level of decision making in him? And then also, how much is that then potentially impacted by the spacing that's around him in the front court you're running?
Yeah, I don't know that he's. I would be really surprised if he was ever, a guy that in running a pick and roll on the strong side would make the like one arm sling pass to the weak side corner, like the Luka pass. Like that's just, I don't see that for him. I do think he's sort of going to be, and has shown signs that he already is, like more of a serviceable single read passer, where it's like he gets downhill, the help comes, he lays it down or he dumps it off to the center for a dunk. Like he can make that pass. And he can, I think, make like the one read to the strong side corner if the help comes off of there. Beyond that, I think I'd be surprised if he became like a high level passer. And I think part of that too is just like the guy can just finish everything. So I think he's more wired to just be like, I would just love to get some contact here and try to finish, or I want to try to dunk this like that, which is probably okay, because that plays much more to his strengths. I think he should be hyper aggressive, like trying to seek contact when he's driving.
Aside from the Alperen Şengün and Jalen Green, just futures, what is the, I dictate too much of how these podcasts go. So what's the biggest storyline that you're looking at, following, tracking as we head into this season?
So I was going to say Jalen, but I guess if I can't pick Jalen, I want to see Amen. Like Amen is like sneaky. Like I have him tied with Şengün as most intriguing prospect on this team. Right? Like he may have the highest upside in this team alongside Şengün. Like he is just so unique and so multidimensional. And like obviously the weaknesses are there, but because the strengths are so strong, he is a great finisher. He's an uber athlete. He is already very strong defensive player. I could see him, Dan, I know this is crazy. I know this is like a serious NBA podcast. I could see him challenging for all defensive second team next year. That's how good he is.
If he has the playing time under his belt, I don't think that's wild at all, just based off what we've seen from him.
Yeah, he's crazy. I've never seen a rookie. I mean, obviously, I cover the Rockets. My scope is a little bit limited, but like, I've never seen a rookie that good defensively, particularly a wing.
Yeah, like, I was gonna say Wemby is probably the best defensive rookie I've ever seen since Tim Duncan, at least. And I was too young when he was a rookie, but as a wing, yeah. I mean, even if you look at some of the players,
like Simmons, right? Like Ben Simmons, like that. That's like the last one I could think of.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So, I mean, I'd be curious. I don't think voters would give it to a sophomore who isn't Wemby, but I do think that he could be on the level of just like he will be in the conversation because he's that dominant defensively and the tools that he has, like. It's the counting stats. It'll be the advanced metrics. And then just like you watch the eye test and he is dominant on the defensive end.
Right. And so like that's who I want to watch. Cause you know what? Funny enough, he's the exact same age as these guys, as Jalen and Şengün. Like, and he was drafted last year. He was just an older rookie. That's why it sneaks up on you. But he's kind of in that age 22 season too, right? So if you're gonna see a leap naturally, like you may see one from him too. So I kind of group all those three guys together in terms of like let's see what level can they take it to, right? What's their next logical extension? And obviously everyone's gonna be looking at the jump shot. I think the jump shot like this sounds bad. I tend to believe, like, my gut instinct, put a gun to my head, that just may be broken, right? Like that just may be like one of the, like the base. You're starting from such a low baseline that you shouldn't bank developmentally on that becoming a thing, right? I think what I'm more interested in seeing is, can he become, like, his ceiling as a player, is that higher than Alperen Şengün's? And if it is, okay, now I got to make a decision, right? Because I don't think those two can coexist because of the limited jump shot.
So
right.
yeah, and that's what I mean. Let's get into that, because that's been a big topic. And we saw Amen Thompson like kind of hit his sweet spot offensively without Alperen Şengün, and because he's doing a lot of the off-ball work. And so in theory, you look at, Amen Thompson, not if he doesn't have the ball as much, like, okay, then why can't he fit with Alperen Şengün? You mentioned the jumper stuff. And so that's where it does get super awkward, because with Amen Thompson's development, if you need to find out if he's more important to you than Şengün, don't you need to get to a point where he has more on-ball reps? And I know this isn't like, let me be clear. I know the Rockets weren't a heavy pick and roll team, but he's averaging under 3 pick and rolls per 36 minutes last year. That's like, you need to see more. And even just like the drives, those were pretty low per 36 minutes. So how do you, because you have Şengün and also some of these other guys, like, how do you go about are you just going to have to make some tough calls? Or there are going to be things that fall by the wayside? Is some of this like Alperen Şengün might have to adapt, or you just get to a point where you're like really rigidly staggering them? Because I do think if you need to figure out how good Amen is going to be, and like, if you also want him to develop, I'm with you on the jumper. Like, it'd be nice if he gets it, but it's almost like, well, if he could start hitting more of those floaters, like that we saw some of those from him, if those go in at a higher clip and he's taking them at a higher frequency, that's at least a different level to his offensive game. But he needs the reps to have that. And I would assume you're not going to have that in the core lineups because of Alperen Şengün and some of these other guys. And so can you get to that, like enough of that with the secondary units?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a credit to him that he was as efficient as he was playing that. It wasn't even a secondary. He was playing a tertiary role. He was playing off the ball. He was playing like Andre Iguodala,
role. Or like even Aaron Gordon-esque at points, like kind of floating around the dunker spot area as well.
It was like, and he was still effective, which is like that's why he's so impressive, right? Like the role he was cast in, you didn't expect anything from him, and he was still, what the hell? Like, what is this? Right? Like, and like, it's not that no one didn't think he was talented. It's that we thought the jumper was going to be such a big thing, right? It was going to be such a, like, he's a guard who can't shoot, right? So that's really hard to adapt to in the NBA, but he was still effective. He was still positive as a rookie guard who can't shoot threes. That's really impressive. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how you do it. I'm not going to lie. I don't have an answer for you, because that guard rotation is really, really, I mean, you got Van Vliet, you got Green, you got Whitmore,
Reed Shepherd.
You got Shepherd now, and Shepherd's not even going to be able to play, to be honest. Like he's probably not going to be able to play this first year, unless guys get hurt. I see him being a G League guy, and that's not really a big deal. Like, Whitmore was a G League guy until guys got hurt, right? But that's just the state of play when you look at like how do you're going to have a 15-man rotation? You can't do that, right?
Right. So, that is. So, I mean, I would say with Amen specifically, to focus on him, like, to wrap it up, I wonder if they can just, I feel like, not if they can, they can. I think the best way might be, okay, like the Jabari minutes without Şengün where he's your 5. And like, that's when Amen needs to be playing most, and you get him the on-ball reps, because you don't have to deal with not occupying the same space, but some of the floor spacing issues. You could surround those two with shooters. I mean, Cam Whitmore would qualify. That would, honestly, I was going to float, like, make sure Reed Shepherd's in those lineups because of his threat level off the ball. But you're talking about whether he would struggle to get minutes. 6 years into these look aheads, it's clear that I dictate too much of how these podcasts go. So I've been asking everyone, what is the biggest storyline for this team, the Pacers in this case, that you'll be tracking either entering the season or throughout the entire season?
I mean, I think to an extent, it's the same storyline that's been the storyline at training camp for them the last 2 years. I remember
Miles
2 years
Turner's
ago they talked
future?
about like we need. That's a tale as old as time, Dan. No, I think they talked about 2 years ago like we need to address defense and togetherness. They talked about last year, some of their requisites for people earning playing time because they had so much competition at camp was going to be, defense and unselfishness. It's going to be what's it going to take for them to improve on the defensive end and what's a realistic expectation. I think that's going to be the overarching thing this year because, like we said, I think that they showed enough proof of concept, regardless of what the injuries were in the playoffs, to think that they can still be a very good regular season team. The offensive rating held up in the playoffs. They outscored opponents in each round of the playoffs when Pascal and Tyrese were on the floor, including against Boston, who were not nearly as banged up, obviously, as the Bucks. And the Knicks were. There's lots of little things that you can point to there, but if they're going to maintain the success that they had last year, I do think that they need to have a little bit more reliable of a defense because that's what stood out in games. The losses that they had to Boston, obviously, those were somewhat the witching hour of things that you can't really completely explain that went wrong, but also one team had a defensive foundation they could rely on. One team was more defensively versatile, and it wasn't the Pacers in those games. So that's the main thing that they need to address, and I think that's going to be the main storyline that we're going to be watching all season.
What are sort of the one or two elements that would go into this team sustaining a league average or better defense then?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had this tagline last year where I said the defense doesn't need to be good. It doesn't even need to be mediocre. It merely needs to be bad, and it's too often terrible. And that took place in a game when they had one of their 150 duels with the Atlanta Hawks. And I later issued a retraction because they did show some progress and they did make some adjustments to the scheme as the year went on. And that's what I told people. I just recently got asked a mailbag question by somebody said, what would it take to make this defense great? That's too lofty of an expectation. You need to get in the range of like bad ranging to meh. Because I will say that I think that this coaching staff, like when you look at it, I mean, I'll ask you, if you looked at the personnel on the roster, do you think that the Pacers have top 10 offensive talent? Just based on the personnel.
I mean, I might just be colored by what I know Tyrese Halliburton is, but I guess in a vacuum, you probably wouldn't look at, especially heading into last season and being like, oh, Nembhard, no Siakam. So yeah, I don't think you'd look at the roster like, oh, that's for sure a top 10 offensive team.
Yeah, you wouldn't think that that's going to be the number one offense in the playoffs. I doubt. And again, like some of that had to do with injuries, but not completely. Because let's face it, like Giannis is a big deal defensively, but Dame being out kind of helped the Bucks defense. Didn't make them a better team, but defensively they were better when Dame wasn't playing. So I think that they get more out of their personnel offensively. And I've told people this many times. I think they're getting about what should be expected defensively, unless you look at a few specific things. So I think last year they ranked 30th in closeouts per 100 possessions. And in part, that's because they started the year really being somewhat dogmatic with the guard your yard scheme. They were going to do all pick and rolls 2 versus 2. As the year went on, they were willing to relax that. They weren't trying to, use Buddy as a primary against Giannis Antetokounmpo. They were building a 3-player wall. Some of what you saw in the Lakers in the finals of the in-season tournament where they scored 86 points in the paint while the Pacers, quote-unquote, held them to 2 of 13 shooting from 3. There were changes to that specifically in the playoffs where it's like, okay, now we're seeing Siakam, even helping off of the ball side corner. He's flooding clear strong side off of Achua, off of Josh Hart in ways that they weren't necessarily as adaptable with earlier in the season. So I would expect some changes there, but I don't think that no matter what this coaching staff does with the scheme, I don't think that's necessarily going to significantly move the needle because, to be honest, while it probably wasn't what I would have done at the beginning of the season, they tried a polar opposite scheme the prior year, and both years they resulted in a bottom 10 defensive outcome, including after they acquired Siakam. They still ranked around 22nd after that. So I would look at, can Tyrese come back and be a little bit more physical? Can he take a bump and still potentially get over a screen? Because he did show that a little bit. They don't want to give up switches with him. So they use a lot of show coverage. And he got a little bit better at holding the line on that. Maybe even, diverting the ball handler a little bit. So can he show a little bit more physicality and not get overpowered? Is there ways that you could potentially use Miles as more of, a weak side rim protector rather than a ball side anchor? Just dialing up their overall attentiveness. That's something that I like to point out with regard to Benedict Mathurin because you can dial up energy and effort. I'm not always sure how to project, awareness. It might all click for him. I don't completely know, but that's something there. And then the biggest thing, they need to address the hole that they have at the wing. Like, they still have it. Like, they acquired Pascal Siakam, and a very telling thing, the night before they acquired Pascal Siakam, they played the Utah Jazz, and Andrew Nembhard was guarding Lauri Markkanen. They acquired Pascal. They really toyed around with his role in the first, however many games that he was there. By the time you get in the playoffs, it's game 4. And when Tyrese is out and Ben Shepherd's a starter, and they can put Ben Shepherd at the point of attack, Pascal was put on Drew Holiday, and they had Andrew Nembhard and Aaron Nesmith back on Tatum and Brown. It was not Pascal Siakam doing that. So what type of role they think that they want him to have, and then just can Matherin or Walker become that guy? Can Benedict Matherin or Jarris Walker be a person that you could eventually see ending up being in a starting lineup and having some impact, given that they are more wing-sized wings? And I'm sure we'll get into each of their games more specifically later, but I think that the solutions more so are going to have to come from little incremental steps from various players on the roster, or eventually seeking an outside solution with the consolidation trade that we kind of alluded to before.
I'll have to circle back later to that comment you made about if they're struggling, if they would consider like anything nuclear. But I want to ask you this, aside from the fallout from whatever happened with Paul George, him not being there, what is the biggest storyline that you will be tracking for this team, not just heading into next season, but throughout next season?
Is James Harden the James Harden that he was in Philadelphia?
Okay.
He was very good last year. And so I don't want to sit here and say he was better in Philadelphia. His numbers were better in Philadelphia, but I think he played really well last year. I think he was very efficient. I think he never really went outside of himself to handle the responsibilities. But they're going to need him a lot more this year, obviously with no PG and depending on Kawhi's health status, not just to start the season, but during the season. So I kind of look at it as that's the biggest storyline for the season is what James Harden do they get? Do they get the James Harden of last year who averaged almost 17 and almost 9 assists? Or do they get the James Harden from Philly who was 21 and 11, who's shooting more often? Ty Lue said on Tuesday when he talked that they're going to use James in more pick and rolls. They want him to do more things. They need him to shoot more. They need him to take more shots. They need him to score more. They need him to do everything. If there's one thing we've learned about James Harden, he's one of the greatest offensive engines in the history of basketball. And when he wants to shoot, there's probably not 5 better offensive players in the game right now than him. The problem comes down to whether or not he will shoot, because at times he wouldn't. And, he dealt with injuries at times the latter half of last season. And then it also comes down to whether or not he's actually getting to the rim.
Yeah.
He didn't get to the rim a lot last year. Last year, I believe he only got only 25% of his shots last year were inside of 8 feet. It was 33% the year before in Philly. I want to say it was 42.5 2 years ago. And 3 years ago, I think it was 45%. Like he's drastically gone down. He's become a heavy jump shooter, which in his defense, great 3-point shooter, especially off the dribble, obviously. I just think he needs to get to the rim a lot more. And I'm really interested to see that process because I asked Ty specifically on Tuesday, do you think with no PG, and obviously I know I keep saying this, but losing PG is obviously a big deal, but does losing PG allow them to streamline their offense more, where you're not trying to get 3 main guys involved? It's one main ball handler, another guy like Kawhi, who is the best offensive player on the team but won't handle the ball as much as Kawhi, and then everyone fits in around them rather than trying to fit PG into that as a puzzle piece as well. And he said he does think that to some degree there's going to be a level of streamlining that's going to take hold here. He said that's the idea. He said it's always tough to replace that kind of player. Mm-hmm. James and Kawhi are their focus offensively, but obviously Norm's going to be a focus, and he did say they're going to post Ivica Zubac a lot more, and he said it's on him to find the right spacing around those guys, which is going to be the biggest non-James question of the season, is how they non-James and Kawhi question of the season, which is how do they figure out spacing? Because they lost PG, say what you want about him, all-time great shooter, especially for his size, floor spacer and all this. They lost that guy. And they have to find shooting out of guys who not really had a great track record of being great shooters. Derrick Jones Jr., obviously chief among them. Chris Dunn, also among them. They get Nico Batum back, very good shooter, but Nico doesn't shoot a lot. So that, like, he helps with the spacing, but not as much as a guy like PG would. The big wild card in all this, I'm sure we'll get into this later as well, is what do you get out of Kevin Porter Jr.? We don't know if there's going to be a suspension from the league office. There probably will be, just based on things that have gone around and been said. But we don't know yet. We don't know what that suspension length would be if there is one. And we don't know what kind of player he is right now. He missed a year of NBA basketball. He went to Greece. He only played 5 or 6 games in Greece, and then he came back. That's a lot of downtime for not playing NBA high-level basketball. So that's the big wild card in all this and what they can expect out of their offense.
So with James Harden, though, I guess if you're going to streamline the offense, that looks more like James Harden is kind of the center of everything. Because I thought he did a good, I mean, we saw this in Philly too, where he was kind of toggle between 2 existences, but like he goes to LA and almost half of his made threes came off assists, which is just unheard of for Harden. So if you're going to put the ball in his hands, I think that's mostly fine if you're looking to streamline your offense. But if you're looking for more variability and maybe Harden's shot selection, you've kind of already mentioned this, but how do you get him to the rim if he's on the ball? Because like that seems more like at this stage of his career, it'd have to be an off-ball thing because he's not going to get by a ton of guys. And so I think his rim frequency, you mentioned like inside 8 feet, he was below 20% of his shots coming from like actually at the rim last year, which was a career low, I believe. And so if you have, I mean, like Kawhi's even kind of that type of player now too. This is, you've added some maybe complementary rim pressure in Derrick Jones Jr., so Terrence Mann floating around out there, Chris Dunn as well. But I just like, what does streamlining the offense then look like? Is it just running it through James Harden, running a lot? You mentioned posting up Zubats more, but is a lot more pick and rolls featuring James Harden? Like, I'm just curious as to what that winds up looking like.
I think it's going to be a lot more pick and rolls. I think they're just going to have to lean. They might end up having to be one of the highest pick and roll frequency teams in the league to have a sustainable offense. I mean, Ty did talk about, since he's been there, they've been basically a top 5 offense every year. And obviously Kawhi helps with that, and so does PG, and obviously getting James last year. Like, of course, if you have star players, odds are you're going to have a great offense. Like, that makes sense. But Ty did work a lot of magic in the year, I want to say 21-22. Kawhi missed the entire year. PG only played 30 games, and they were still a winning team. I think that's what they're going to lean their hat on is, look, we're not going to be as great offensively as we were last year, but we have to be better defensively. They went out and got all these defensive guys, Derrick Jones, Chris Dunn, Nico Batum. They get these defensive first guys to hopefully boost them on that end to where they're not always playing against a set defense on the other end. And I think when they do play against set defenses, they're just going to have to hope that they run enough pick and rolls and have enough floor spacing to where on the off chance James does get downhill, he has ample runway to get to the rim and do what he needs to do. I remember there was a game very soon after he arrived. It was in LA. I want to say it had to be Memphis because he was being guarded by Santi Aldama. And I remember in the 4th quarter, and I sat where my because they changed the media seats for Into a Dome from where it was at Staples. But at Staples, my media seat was basically center court up where the broadcasters are. So I got to actually kind of sit next to a lot of cool people in my years covering them from that position. And I had someone next to me, and James tries to take Santi Aldama off the dribble, and it didn't happen, like 2 or 3 straight possessions. And I remember this person next to me and I just going, oh, this might be bad. And yet, throughout the year, I will say this, he did get into better shape. He was able to start getting past people at a higher rate. Obviously not to the rate that prime James Harden did because he's not prime James Harden anymore. But I think they're hoping that he comes in, knock on wood, he comes in shape. Everything I've seen seems that he is in shape and in great shape, in fact. And hoping that he's able to maybe not just get the burst back, but get the will back to this is your team right now. The ball's in your hands all the time. Go do whatever you need to do, and we'll live with it. And they're going to have to spam a lot of pick and rolls with Zoo. Maybe they try to play small and just try to get spacing that way where Nico plays the 5 and you run pick and pop with Nico because Nico's also a great facilitator and connector out of those. that maybe that's another way. Maybe you incorporate some of that to get James a little bit more wiggle room. They have a lot of questions they need to answer. But we also don't know what the answer is going to be until probably 10, 15 games into the season with him, especially
Well, that's assuming
James
Kawhi's
specifically.
even playing by that point. We might have to wait longer for what the full strength answer is.
I mean, going off of what they've said, they haven't ruled out opening night because they're not going to rule out opening night until they absolutely have to, because opening night is the opening of the new arena.
I don't even mean to interrupt you, but like that
Go ahead.
would be surreal in a negative way of look at what they gave up to put Kawhi, and I'm not relitigating the trade, but like those two were the face of this distant era. The whole point was kind of like, we're going to open the Inuit Dome with these 3 stars. And imagine if on the opening night of the Inuit Dome, they have one star and it's neither PG nor Kawhi on the court. That's just like,
yeah,
you could believe it because of everything that we've seen over the years, but it's also kind of mind melting.
Yeah, it's as I would say, it's very Clippers in a lot of ways. That they've had 13 straight winning seasons, and the one season they go into the new arena, basically it looks like the same old thing has been happening for them, whether karma or curses or just plain sheer dumb luck. They've had all of it.
And this is, I think there's a number of different ways that you could go with this one, including a couple of things you just talked about. But so what is the biggest storyline for the Lakers this season? Is it how JJ Redick fares? Is it whether, or do they have the gall to make some, I don't want to call it seismic, but like significant roster upgrades? Or is it something else that's happening on the court? Like if they believe in this product is, well, can this team level up internally at all? What does LeBron look like at age 40? How many games do LeBron and AD play in? They played 66 games together last year, and the Lakers still just weren't considered a contender. That's the thing that blows my mind when I see fans like say, oh, well, Dalton Connect's an upgrade over Taurean Prince. And one, you don't get to just say that about a rookie.
Yeah.
Oh, Taurean Prince was miscast, probably relied too much upon by Darvin Ham, but it wasn't like they don't have wings. They still don't have wings.
Still didn't do anything about that. Still didn't do anything.
What is the biggest storyline for you for this team?
I think we've kind of gone over it. It is like there's several things, and none of them are sexy. Sorry, Lakers fans, but it is going to be how JJ and his crew handle this staff. It is going to be how they instill, what type of defensive mindset they instill. But because at the same time as I'm saying, like, yeah, it's about the the philosophy and getting everybody to buy in. It's very difficult to make chicken salad out of chicken shit. Okay, I'm sorry. If you don't have the defensive personnel, it's very difficult to put a defensive lineup out there. What you can't, you can perfect it and get the most out of and maximize guys by putting them in better positions and like shifting the philosophy in terms of crashing the boards and shifting the philosophy in terms of how, whether you're going to have AD and drop coverage or or whatever the case may be. Yes, things can be shifted, but ultimately it's also a matter of the roster. Again, you can't have 3 non-defenders in your starting 5 every single night. You're not going to be successful in the NBA on in any real or significant manner if you have that scenario. I think and this is the thing. This is a point of contention. Some people think Bam is the most, versatile defender in the league, big defender in the league. Some people, whoever you think it is. I personally have watched AD up close. I've seen what he can do. I've seen what he's been asked to cover for. And I still say, even right now, I'll take AD as the anchor of my defense. But you can't expect him to, make miracles happen when you have just total sieves and you have individuals that are being permitted to not really give much of an effort on that end. No disrespect to the legends, but we all know who I'm talking about. For long stretches of the regular season, of course. You can't have that and expect them to be good. So really, what are you going to do with this roster? How are you going to implement, your philosophies? And then really, truly, how are you going to place your players that you do ultimately have? How are you going to put them in the best position to win?
I've been asking people to open things up. What's their biggest storyline that they're tracking for their team leading into next season? And I pride myself on kind of knowing what the answer is going to be for most of these teams from my guess. I have zero idea what you're about to tell me. I feel like I could maybe guess, but there's like 3 to 5 things that I could, if I was to just ask this, like answer it myself. So what is your biggest storyline that you're monitoring for this team entering next year? Like, it could be just the health. It could be the fit of Zach Edey. We really haven't seen the fit of Marcus Smart with everyone. There's just so many different directions to go.
I think the biggest storyline is pretty simple. This is a keep the main thing the main thing. The biggest storyline is Ja Morant back? Like, if Ja Morant is just that guy, we briefly saw it last year. I mean, it was almost a storybook last year when he first came back. He missed the first 25 games. The Grizzlies were 6-19. In his first game back, the first game Ja Morant played last year, he hit a buzzer beater to beat the Pelicans. He had 34 points. They rallied from 24 down. He hits a shot at the buzzer to win. They win their first 4 games with Ja Morant, and it's like, whoa, we're back. But then after 9 games, he gets injured, out for the season. He won Western Conference Player of the Week the first week he played last year. So it looked like Ja Morant was back last season, but we only got 9 games. So the main issue for the Grizzlies is Ja Morant going to come back and be the all NBA caliber player that he was beforehand. There's no reason he shouldn't be. Still very, very young, still very, very good. But it seems like the whole league has forgotten about Ja Morant. And I listen to a lot of preview podcasts. I read stuff. I see like the player rankings, and I never get upset about a player ranking. I know they're for entertainment, but my eyebrow did go up very, very high when it's like Ja Morant's the 30th best player in the NBA. Like, based on what? I've seen that multiple, like that ballpark where I'm like, the guy is a 30 point per game scorer. The guy can't be guarded. The guy's a great passer, and the guy has won. He's won consistently. It's weird where people draw in the off the court stuff talking about Ja, and I don't know what it is. And they say things about him. They describe his game as like, doesn't play a winning style. And I don't think I'm fighting a straw man here. Like, I see people saying stuff, and I'm like, he's won. He's won his entire career. They were supposed to be awful his rookie season, and they were competitive and good. They would have made the playoffs if they hadn't come up with the fictitious bubble tournament thing where you had to qualify for the playoffs. In the middle of the season, Dan, they changed the rules for the playoffs.
They did it to impede Ja Morant.
They did it to give Zion Williamson a chance of making the playoffs. I can't believe the league presidents or the whoever's involved signed off on it. If I was in a fantasy league and you changed the rules halfway through to keep my team out, no. Ja Morant's won. Ja Morant in the playoffs has been amazing. He's even stepped up his level of play in the playoffs. So the biggest storyline for the Grizzlies is basically, is Ja Morant going to play 70 games and reclaim, I think, his rightful place as being one of the top 15 players in the league?
Is there like because he's still only 25, he's super young.
Yeah.
Is the next step for him still just like, hey, he hasn't shot 35% on spot up 3 since his rookie year. Let's just have that happen, because the volume is like kind of there. I mean, I know last year he didn't play a ton, but like when you look at kind of the trajectory of the 3-point attempts, like, okay, I'm okay with the volume. Now, if those things could fall, and I'm not asking him to hit all these like complicated step backs, but that just kind of feels like offensively the last frontier for him.
Yeah, there's some formula for how good the Grizzlies are going to win next year. There's some like fake formula that I'm going to make up. It's some combination of Ja Morant games played times Ja Morant 3-point percentage. Like, if Ja Morant, maybe include Gigi Jackson in there too. Like, if Ja and Gigi can make like 34% of their 3-pointers and also be healthy and play, the Grizzlies are going to win a lot of games in the regular season. If Ja shoots 32% from 3, it's going to be a little bit harder. So yeah, I think still that jump shot, if he could add that, just get to the De'Aaron Fox level of knocking down a few more jumpers, that's going to help his game, I think, tremendously. Maybe the other thing you always ask about his defense, although Ja he's been a part of really good defensive teams. So I think he can do enough there to not be a total just sieve and allow everyone to penetrate past him. I do think, maybe the final level for Ja Morant's game is just consistently being able to hit 3-pointers. We're not asking for the world. 34% would be great.
But when you're looking at this season, what is the biggest storyline to you that you will be tracking as we get into it and then over the course of it? I feel like I could guess what you're going to say if I had to, but I'm very interested to hear your answer.
Well, now you're going to have to tell me your guess after. Obviously, I mean, health aside, because I think that's an obvious one. I'm super curious if Bam is going to continue to be the Bam that we saw
I did not think you were going to say that, and I love it because that's real sicko shit. So please.
Wait, what did you
carry on.
think I was gonna say?
Contract year Jimmy Butler. Like,
No, that is I don't know if it's just me. I am not concerned about that at all. This man is not going anywhere. I almost feel like both him and the front office, primarily Pat Riley, are like playing with people at this point. When I saw that quote from Pat come out, like, honestly, I was just like, oh, this is totally orchestrated by him and Jimmy together to kind of feed into the whole Heat Twitter mania that was going on at that time. I don't know. Maybe I'm going to eat my words. I'm not concerned. I'm really curious how Bam is going to progress. And less so, honestly, I don't necessarily even, I mean, more is always better, but I don't necessarily expect more. I just want him to stay consistently this aggressive on both ends of the floor.
Let's stick with the Jimmy thing for a second. So you say you're not concerned. And I think you could probably argue that contract year Jimmy Butler might be terrifying for the rest of the league, but it also does create a storyline because there's the report. I don't care about the Brooklyn report. I dare you to go sign with the Nets at this point, is what I would say. But the whole he wants to the report that he wants to get to free agency. This is someone who is 35 years old. Like, your timeline and team is very much still built around him. He is headed into a contract year. He will have a market if he gets to free agency because he's one of the players who can actually shift things that might actually get the free agency now. You don't think that kind of has the potential to become a distraction for this team?
No. I don't. Jimmy's just built different. I feel like I've never seen a player so, I don't even know how to put this. I just feel like he's preparing himself for what comes next already and has been doing so for so long. And that's not to say that he's near retirement anytime soon or that he isn't like completely giving his all on the court. But I feel like between Big Face and the aloe yoga stuff, I don't know. To me, he's not the type of player that I'm concerned is kind of scrambling because he's nearing the end and wants this big payout. I think at this point, he wants to win as much as possible and as badly as anyone, but I don't think he's necessarily going to bring down the team or completely shift his entire life because of that. Again, I don't know if I just have a different read on him or a wrong read on both him and Riley, but just from things that I've noticed, especially last season, but even the 2 or 3 seasons prior, there's a lot of leaning in to everything, all the noise that's happening outside of the team, whether that's media or fans. And I don't know, to me, it's all just them like leaning into this narrative.
That's interesting. I would be very concerned if you hit a rough patch or if this team is not as good as fans or internally they want to be. I don't think he's going to like destroy them from within, but that's when it becomes gut check time of, well, like if we're like 8th, like what does that mean? Like he's only going to get older. And so that's the perspective I'm coming at it from. And also I think Jimmy Butler and the Heat in general have lost some of their mystique about like kind of fuck the regular season when you just weren't healthy to even once you got to the playoffs. And like, there's only so many times you can get to the postseason while being like a fringe playoff team anyway. And so I think, again, it might not be, I think Jimmy Butler plays well. I think his aging curve has been fine. He put up like all-star caliber numbers last year. The 2-point efficiency dropped a little bit, but he did take more threes. He made more threes. I still am very curious to see how he specifically does age. Have you made anything of that about just like the trajectory of how his game gets, not only just leading into this season, but like if they're going to re-sign him, it's going to be years beyond that too.
Yeah, I mean, I do think his game is going to have to change a little bit. I do think he's smart enough to do so in a way that it doesn't take, God forbid, like a major injury to have him have come to that moment. Whether that is, I don't know if it's taking more threes or honestly just becoming more of a facilitator. I think that he would rather protect his health than go full-fledged into, the way that he's been playing, I don't know, maybe 2-3 seasons ago and risk that. However, with that said, I mean, the man's conditioning is A+. You see, I know you can't necessarily judge everything based on social media, but you see all the work that he puts in. You
see the shoulder pump. I judge everything by shoulder pumps, and Jimmy gets one of the best shoulder pumps in the NBA. So
I don't know why, but that just made me think of Zion, who is an entire different caliber of player, if you can even call him a player at this point. But no, I don't know. I think he's going to be smart about it. The other thing too is Jimmy doesn't do anything anyone else's way. And I feel like that also gives me a little bit more confidence in his future with the Heat. I think if we were talking about most other players, then yes, it would be a concern. But to me, Jimmy is just Jimmy. So I don't know. I hope I'm not wrong, but I'm not really concerned about that.
I get to dictate so much of how these episodes go that I wanted to include this question to start things off this year. What is the biggest storyline you'll be monitoring for this team throughout this coming season?
Health first, but I'm not even going to talk about it because it's not fun. But obviously that's going to be the number one. The most fun one, and the one that was worth talking about, it's probably just like Dame, Chris, and Giannis together. And you mentioned the Bucks were really good when those three played together, and like a really good to the point of you'd think like, okay, they're probably a contender anyway. But some of the buzz is like it should be better. And I think it can be better. I mean, I think if you watch, I think you would agree, and a lot of people have, like they weren't all that cohesive at all, especially the fabled Dame Giannis pick and roll. They didn't really get good at it. The Dame Brook pick and roll was better, and Chris Giannis actions were better because they've been doing it for a decade. No real surprise there. But all of the focus since Doc really came in was we need to get this played down. Like that's their thing. I think that can separate them from every other team in the league is you could look at other teams are deeper, certainly Boston. Maybe you can say other teams have more top end talent. I don't think there is another action, maybe outside of Denver, that could be as devastating singularly as a Dame Giannis pick and roll. Like I think it should be as unguardable as anything that exists, especially given they have the personnel around it, right? Gary Trent on one wing, Chris Middleton on the other, whether you have another guard, a big, whoever, someone in the dunker spot, it's pretty unguardable. It should be totally impossible to stop. I mean, their gravity totally shifted to teams doubling Dame around half court, which Giannis has never seen anything like this before. The floor totally shifted. So really those two, but I'll throw in Chris as well. I think they're going to do some with Chris. He's not always just going to be spacing, right? He's a really good player. But like those three being even better together, I think that's what, whether the regular season numbers are the same, better, a little worse in terms of their on-court efficiency. If they're going to win a title, it's because a close game in the last 5 minutes, they can just say, we're going to get a really good look every single time. Like we're going to score every time. We'll make the stops. Brooke and Giannis and Trent and whoever will figure that out. But we can just be totally unguardable and get a great shot every time and just win. So that's what I think their biggest storyline is can those two go from we made it work because we're so good to, okay, we're actually on all cylinders and no one can guard this action at all anymore. I think that's going to be number one for me.
Dan, we're going to talk about the Minnesota Timberwolves real quick here ahead of the 24-25 season. As you look at this remade Wolves team post big trade, what do you think the main storyline is for them that you'll be watching for, paying attention to this season?
Now, had we covered this before, a month ago, which we did with Kyle Teige of the Dane Moore NBA show, I think it would have been Rob Dillingham and how they integrate him. But now it's just going from Karl Anthony Towns to Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo and what that fit looks like. I understand the logic of what they did, and I think I've kind of come out of it that the deal almost seems safer for them than it does the Knicks, but I understand it for both teams. But there is real risk there, I think, especially once you get to the playoffs, because I do think the theory, aside from the financial benefits you get of Julius Randle potentially being an expiring contract, is you've now added someone who's just has more on-ball gravity as a shot creator. That is not translated to the playoffs. Now, maybe it's different on a team that has Anthony Edwards as the number one option, as opposed to, okay, yeah, they had Jalen Brunson for 1 year, but the other year, Julius Randle was the number one option. And so like, that's not a situation you want to be in. Does it harm your defense at all? It could. I think it makes Rudy Gobert's job harder because of how well Karl Anthony Towns played at that end. I do find myself more optimistic, though, because DiVincenzo fills what was arguably their biggest weakness last year. Right. I think we still default to secondary creation, ball handling, passing, whatever. But like their wing shooting was not a strong suit. And now it's absolutely a potential strength because in two ways, because Julius Randle is going to allow Anthony Edwards to play off the ball a little bit more, but then just Dante DiVincenzo is going to come in and light it up. And I think your bench overall during the non-Edwards minutes, you could do something like if you're using Randle, DiVincenzo, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker as kind of your like base, and then Naz Reid is sort of like your base second unit heavy mob. Oh my God. Like there's a lot of two-way potential there and enough. I think Julius Randle gives you enough creation. You could sprinkle Rob Dillingham in there. Dante DiVincenzo can do a little bit off the ball. You don't want him to do too much. I'm just fascinated to see how it all comes together. And finally, before I throw it to you, I think people have talked a lot about how Chris Finch hasn't been inventive enough on the offensive end. I think he hasn't really had the personnel to do so. And now you add someone like Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo. I think we'll see that part of his coaching really flourish or like get super experimental, or you'll be able to like more identify like something stand out from that the Wolves are doing.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the new angle to cover is just like, and this is one of our first questions when the deal went down, is like, how much of this move is a basketball move versus a financial move? Because the risk that you alluded to is you just took a team that, you know, had every chance of advancing to the finals potentially, like looking at this year based on how last year went, and maybe made it worse on the floor for financial reasons, maybe, but with some distance from it, the pieces kind of fit. And a lot of that's DiVincenzo, as you alluded to, because his ability to shoot on the move at volume and play make as a secondary guy is just like, we got new dimensions now. So that it's different, and that's risky because the Wolves were already established as really good. But I do think monitoring how much different and maybe more effective the offense is just like, that's what we got to focus on with these new pieces. How does Randall fit in? What's the best use of him? Is it as a backup creator, maybe on second units? Yeah. I don't know. The other thing I'd throw out there, and you said, I think you're right, is like, well, a month ago or before the trade, we would have been asking about Dillingham. Before the draft, the storyline would have been, well, how much bigger of a leap can Anthony Edwards make? Like that's like that. Really, we can talk about everything else we want, and there are a lot of things to discuss with the Wolves, but like the question of, is this guy now just a top 5 MVP level player for the next 5 to 7 years? Like, is that what we are going to get? Because there were certainly signs of that, you know, down the stretch last season. All the face of the league stuff was overblown. The next Jordan stuff is unfair and ridiculous, but like Edwards taking that leap, I arguably might matter more than anything else we're talking about. And it's just going to be fascinating for me to watch. Like, I don't know, is the playmaking going to take a huge jump? Is he going to, you know, cut out some of the pull-up twos and replace those with fouls drawn for free throws? Like,
or catch and shoot threes.
Catch and shoot threes. Like there's a lot of ways to go. And I do think the trade and like the eventful draft for the Wolves definitely is like push that to the back. And I think maybe as the year goes on, that's something that might matter more than anything.
And also the Dillingham subplot is still there because you could say it's a future focused move, but I honestly wonder, had the order of events flipped, let's say the Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo trade happens first, do you think they're still making that draft day trade for Dillingham?
That's a great question. You would like to think that they had all this like sort of on the big board as like, well, if this, then that. But I don't know. Because then if you just have DiVincenzo there, do you feel like your second unit has got enough offensive initiation and playmaking and shooting? Like maybe you do.
And do you view, and if you're even taking the longer term approach there as well, do you view Rob Dillingham as can't miss enough to let's play our last best trade chips here?
Well, maybe if the events were reversed, they still pull off a trade like that, but it's not for a player type like Dillingham. They're just like, we're going to shoot the shot and try to turn it into someone that can help in theory, like now. Because I'm like, what's Dillingham's long-term upside? Do you think they view him as like, he's our, I guess at the time it was like, he's going to be next to Ant for 10 years. Like that's what it is.
I do think that's what they probably still view him as someone who can get off the ball quickly, play off the ball, but generate looks for himself and others. I do think we've seen him struggle a bunch already though. And I think you could go to two different schools of thought here. Is we're not going to know if the trade was a mistake or how it pans out for years. Like that's still going to be something that plays out. What does it like? I understand it's a future focused move, but like, does it get harder to get reps in for him now with Randall DiVincenzo there? Is it a little bit easier in the sense that, well, if you play him with one or both of those guys in staggered units from Ant, that his job gets a lot easier to where I think we both could agree, no matter how high you are on Rob Dillingham, the odds of him coming in and just being a net plus as the playmaker with Ant or the primary ball handler with Ant off the floor might not have worked out as well. Now he doesn't necessarily need to do that, but at the same time, you also give Chris Finch a reason not to play him.
Right. Yeah, it does. It cuts both ways for sure. Like you could just make the case that, well, now the lift will be lighter. He won't have to take as many lumps. That's good for his long-term development. Or the flip is like, no, you should just sink or swim with this guy and see, because what you invested to get him. I do think as we're talking about it overall, the Wolves moves do sort of events like that they are thinking about like near term, midterm, long term, because even just getting Randall, who might come off the books, is like that's kind of a mid and long term play. And maybe you think it's also a short term play because he just makes you better than Cat, especially if you factor in DiVincenzo. Like they're kind of, we've definitely criticized some teams for operating on multiple timelines, and it hasn't typically gone very well. But the Wolves kind of seem to be like they've added a third timeline because it's like it's now, later, and much later that they're pretty clearly thinking about both financially and just like what this team looks like. You know, say as Rudy Gobert ages out, right, and then like there's a lot of different factors to be considered here.
And that would be the medium term one would actually be the argument that I think props up, because if you're using this as just, oh, this is way off into the future, that's why they made this. There's very much an element of, well, you could have figured that out as you went along and more picks opened up and you understood what was around it. The medium term argument I find more intriguing, especially now, because it's, if this was a financial move, it was more about Julius Randle being technically an expiring contract while having that player option. So you could look at it from the perspective of, well, if Randall's only going to be here for a year or two max, we know Mike Conley's going to age out very soon. They still want Dillingham in their program so that when those guys leave, he is ready to just take the reins beside Ant and be in the starting lineup. I don't think that was I think it's a fascinating call. I don't know what the right move is. I do think, though, that it's very difficult to juggle what the Wolves are doing then, to where it's, well, how do you balance? Do you have the cushion? Like, are you good enough to get Dillingham reps that potentially come at the expense of positive minutes? What if he's just, rookies have learning curves, I think, especially if you're going to view them as like point guard types. Mm-hmm. And so do you have enough of the cushion, or do you have the stomach enough to like, well, we're still going to figure out ways to sprinkle him in once you get to the playoffs, whatever. If he can't be part of the rotation, not a big deal. I'm very interested to see, though, how heavily they prioritize his development, like now that they've made this move, because I think they almost needed him they did need him to play before. Now I don't think that they do.
Right. Yeah. And that's, again, that's probably good, but also like it sort of adds more risk / devalues the decision to give up a future first, like the last bullet you had.
The Pelicans have like 90 different things to choose from. And so what is your biggest storyline as we're sitting here that you'll be monitoring with this team?
Yeah, look, so just continuing right off that one, is Brandon Ingram going to get traded, and when is that going to happen? I think, they would have liked to have done it around the draft or around when free agency first started. I don't think they necessarily read the market correctly, or I guess I don't even know if that's fair to say, is because I feel like they anticipated there'd be suitors, and I think that's a reasonable anticipation to have. And it just turns out that like no one was interested. And now they're here, and it's September basically. There's a chance maybe Utah wakes up in 2 weeks from now and they're like, you know what, we're not going to tank. We have Lauri Markkanen and Will Hardy, and we're just going to go for it, and maybe they get a deal done. But I would say that chance is very slim. So what you're looking at is Brandon going into the season and without an extension. And at what point is some team going to come around and be like, hey, like, let's move in on Brandon, like the Indiana Pacers did with Pascal Siakam in the middle of the year. So it's not stuff that hasn't happened before, but it's like, who is going to be the team? What's that deal going to look like? And there's other stuff around that deal that needs to happen, particularly from a financial standpoint, just where the Pelicans are at with their finances. So it's just like, man, now you have a pretty fine needle to thread, and it's kind of like you're running out of time to do it.
What is, like, do you have any theories as to why I understand Brandon Ingram can be a difficult player to fit into the larger context of a team. He's still a good player, and he's not old. Like, what do you make of just the tepid trade market? Is this more about like teams still trying to really wrap their head around the new CBA? Does it speak to the level of not desperation, but like, okay, he's headed into his final year. Now we're going to have to pay him. And so that's on their mind. Is it just, well, the Pelicans might be asking for too much, and they have leverage in negotiations with him, but maybe not a ton of leverage in trade negotiations? It's such a bizarre dynamic when looking at his trade value specifically.
For sure. I think it is almost entirely related to his contract demands. From my understanding, him and his agent are seeking the maximum 4-year extension that he's eligible for. That put him around $208 million in new money which is a lot of money.
That's a lot of
It's
money.
a lot of money. It's 30% of the cap. And so that's where the Pelicans have a pause. That's where I think a lot of teams have paused. So it's like, if we're going to spend assets to trade for this guy, and then we got to pay him like a top 15 player. Last year, there was 14 players in the league that made 30% or above the salary cap. So you're going to pay him like a top 15 player. The return has to be a lot more than what Brandon's provided on the basketball court. He's a very good player. He's had availability issues. You know, he's played somewhere around like 45, 50, and then like 60-ish games in the last 3 seasons. So he's missed, 20 plus games each of the last 3 seasons. And then as a player, I think he's topped out. He hasn't quite broken into that absolutely surefire all-star or all-NBA range yet. He's kind of had spurts where he's looked like that guy, and certainly stretches where he's looked like that guy. But teams are just like, man, I don't know. That's not a sure thing. So how can we commit money to that?
So if they're going to go into the season with him, I guess the one easy question is, there's a chance that this just becomes a major distraction that's hanging over the team, right? Because it's constantly being speculated about and talked about and reported on.
I am really worried about that, because the other component of this is the pending Trey Murphy extension. So Trey Murphy is finished 3 years of play. He's eligible for the rookie extension. My understanding is something is going to get done there before the season starts. I think both sides have a good working relationship, but let's say something gets done, I think it's going to be a lot of money. So let's say Trey Murphy's making somewhere in the $30 million range per year, or in the high 20s, but it's still a large amount of money. And then you have Brandon Ingram, who's expiring and doesn't have a deal done. Does he feel some type of way that they prioritize Trey, right? And then what happens if Willie Green decides one game, hey, Brandon's not having a great game, we're going to close this one out with Trey, or we're going to just – some of these decisions without that contract in hand make me a little bit nervous. And then I'm also a little bit nervous how Brandon's going to approach it personally. How is he going to play knowing there's a contract on the line? If he feels jilted that he wasn't given a max, is he going to go out there and prove he's a max player? And what does that look like? Does that mean he's just taking a lot of shots and not necessarily playing within the system? I don't think any of these things are impossibilities. And I just think you've got to have a healthy fear of things going wrong. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong.
Now, you've already said that you're kind of just out on the fit with Zion, and I think DeJounte Murray coming in super complicates that. But if there's a way for Brandon Ingram to fit in the larger context of the team, what does that look like? Is it kind of winding back the clock to that? When you look at his shot profile first season in New Orleans, night and day, basically, compared to what it is that what it looks like to him, that type of offensive role, or is there other things that you're monitoring there? What is the pathway? Because he sounds like he's going to be on this team on opening night. And so what is the best way for him to actually optimize himself or help optimize this team?
100%. It's the shot profile. With DeJounte Murray coming in, Brandon's going to be off the ball a lot more than he's used to being. There's going to be touches split between him, DeJounte, Zion, all these guys who like playing on the ball. Somebody's going to have to get those threes up. Now, DeJounte hasn't been shy in getting those threes off, but he took a fair amount of off the dribble threes as well. I don't know if BI is comfortable taking off the dribble threes. And if he doesn't have the ball in his hands, he might not even have the opportunity to take a lot of off the dribble threes. There's going to be a lot of kickouts. Zion's going to get to the paint, kick out. DeJounte's going to get to the paint, kick out. They're going to play up tempo and transition. He's going to have to take those threes. Defensively, he's trended upwards since, the Alvin Gentry and Stan Van Gundy years, every single year. Under Willie Green, I think Brandon's been solid, and he's had moments of good defense, where I think previously he could have been called a liability. Now I think he holds his own and can be disruptive. He's going to have to maintain that level of defensive intensity. And I'm just a little bit concerned where, okay, you're going to be a player that has to get threes up, and then you're going to have to play defense, and then you're going to have to rebound, and then you're going to have to facilitate. You're going to be super Nick Batum, which is a very, very good player.
Right.
But is that the player he wants to be? Is that the player that he thinks is going to get a max? Ironically, that player would get a ton of money. I mean, we just saw OG Anunoby get a monster
Nick
deal.
Batum got 9 figures back when it was a big deal to get 9 figures.
Exactly. Well, he actually got, I think, a 25% max. He didn't get the 30, but he got 25% max that Batum did. But yeah, OG Anunoby got a monster deal, and Brandon. I don't think it's a stretch to say by any means that Brandon's a far better offensive player than Anunoby, just in terms of capability. So, can you become this versatile glue guy, and does that go against your own self-image, right? I think that's kind of the battle here. It's like, we need you to plug in these holes, but he sees himself as the go-to person, like like a Carmelo.
So if I had to force you to make a prediction on how this ends, whether it's he gets traded before the season, mid-season, we take this to free agency, maybe we see an extension, maybe we see him resign. It's August the 31st. And this is probably going to go up like very soon, because this is the team that could blow up like everything that we talk about. If you had to predict how this ends, what would you go with?
I believe he would get traded mid-season, closer to the trade deadline. I think the Pelicans would kick tires around Jared Allen once again. There's going to be 5 days of trade eligibility there for Allen, who signed his extension earlier this summer. If that fit is going south for Cleveland, Pelicans will 100% be knocking on that door. Barring that, I think the Pelicans would accept just any kind of general, hey, let's just get some salary back that's maybe expiring, maybe a weak pick, or maybe some weirdly interesting young prospect. Look, I'm looking at Houston, for example, right? What are they going to do with Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun? And if we get to the deadline and Houston's just out of this play-in chase and not even like in play-in contention, are they willing to do Jalen Green, maybe one of those future picks, and something, some weird salary that they got? It's going to be an unappetizing trade. The Pacers got 3 picks,
first-round picks,
picks, and then what was it? They got three picks. That's what it was.
Yeah, it was. There's the 20. I guess the Indies 2026 pick is somewhat intriguing, but like if they have Siakam and Halliburton and Nembhard there, I don't know why. Like they're going to be good. So
it was I keep saying the Pacers got it, but the Raptors did, and they got the Bruce Brown contract, and that was essentially it. So who's going to be like the Bruce Brown thing that comes back in this deal? That's kind of like what I'm looking at, like the guy that's playable salary that you're hoping to flip later, for something. I don't know, and I think if that deal doesn't net a center for them, I could see the Pelicans taking if there's any draft capital that comes from that, or taking some of their own draft capital and attaching it to CJ and going after a center with that regard. I'm looking at Nick Claxton in Brooklyn, who I think the Nets are going to be open for business for any of their players at this point, as long as you're willing to meet their price.
Yeah, he would be so good on this team. He probably likes to like do stuff with the ball a little too much than what they're looking for, but he is so good. I love Nick Claxton. Big Nick Claxton fan over here. Is that when you're looking, because we're going to get into more Karl-Anthony Towns stuff, but I'm asking everyone for a promotional episode that'll go up like right when the season starts. What is the biggest storyline that you're tracking for this team? Is it the overarching expectations now because they've made all these moves? Is it maybe one of the new additions? Like what is it?
I mean, as far as storylines are concerned, it has to be like what Karl-Anthony Towns looks like in New York. I think is the biggest.
And that to you, and I'm even sorry to interrupt, but that to you would trounce like, what does Mikal Bridges look like? It's so, I would agree with you. I think just because Mikal Bridges is just universally, like he just fits anywhere and does anything. So
yeah,
it's just interesting that they gave up so much for this guy, but the biggest storyline is, oh, this other center that they brought in, they didn't give nearly as much draft equity up. They gave up real stuff, but.
So that's the funny thing. And again, you alluded to again, my colleague, Mr. Macri, like, when the Knicks went all in for Mikal Bridges, I don't know anybody that said that was a bad trade by the Knicks. Like they gave up a lot. They definitely probably overpaid for Mikal Bridges, like 5 picks, 1 heavily protected Milwaukee pick, and some salary filler, like, and all the swaps, right? But everybody's immediate thought was, man, they have Anunoby and Bridges, like 2 of the best role players potentially in the NBA, to one of the best wing combos. Like you've now created something that is contender worthy, and if they could figure out the right lineup combinations, that has a chance to be deadly. And with Towns, because there's so much concern with Towns, the person, the personality, the match with the market, and what he's just flat out been over the course of his career, the Knicks gave up just flat out less than what they gave up for Bridges, but there's so many questions for one trade over the other. So like it's why I just have no questions about Mikal Bridges. I think he's going to fit perfectly in New York. And the guy never misses games and is playing for Tom Thibodeau. It's going to be a match made in heaven, you know. Although I had one of my, again, another Claudio Casino bet. How many games will Mikal Bridges miss this year? 0.5. I dare somebody to take the over under Tibbs. Like, could you see it? The day that the Mikal Bridges misses his first game, and it's like, oh, Tibbs up to his old. Of course, he misses his first game under Tom Thibodeau. It has to be the concerns about Karl-Anthony Towns. And here's the thing: I think they're going to be an outstanding regular season team. I think they're going to finish top 3 or 4 in offense, top 12 or 13 in defense. They're going to win close to 55 games, but the expectations changed now. This isn't let's just win a bunch of games and hopefully make the second round anymore. There's a conference finals expectations on this team and this roster. And especially when you've gone this all in, that, you know, for the first time in a long time, I can say it will be a disappointment for me if the Knicks don't make it. And I welcome the challenge of that storyline and who it's going to fall on, which part of it might fall on Tibbs, but back to the original point, Karl-Anthony Towns, and going all in on him as your second best guy will have a lot to say about whether they accomplish it or not.
I want to ask you, though, I've been told there have been complaints that I dictate too many of the terms of these podcasts. They've all come from Grant, so it really shouldn't matter, but I've decided. So I'm going to throw this to you, Jacob. What is and it'll be interesting if you guys have different answers here, but what is the biggest storyline you are tracking for this team next season?
Oh, gosh, that's a heavy and loaded question. There's so many good answers here, right? Like, do they play a too big lineup? How do guys progress? What does the closing lineup look like? I'm gonna go with my biggest storyline, biggest development thing I'm watching next season is the year 1 to year 2 Chet Holmgren jump, because I think that jump will be substantial. I wish I had the article up. I do not. But the day that they traded Josh Giddey for Alex Caruso, Woj's ESPN article included a line that talked about how opening up more playmaking and ball handling opportunities on the team by trading away Josh was something that appealed to the Thunder, especially with Chet Holmgren. And I mentioned earlier that I think Chet at the 5 is the future of this team. And I don't want the listeners to get this twisted. I am not saying Chet will be this player. I'm not saying Chet will be this good. Stylistically, I think stylistically on offense, I think Chet Holmgren and Kevin Durant are going to be very, very similar. And I think that is the start of the jump you will see this year. Chet with the ball in his hands more, Chet playmaking, handling out on the perimeter and attacking off the bounce. Chet being the ball handler in a 4-5 pick and roll with Isaiah Hartenstein. I see a lot of KD's style of game offensively in Chet Holmgren, and I think you're going to start to see that leap in year 2. I think the brother just ran out of gas in year 1, honestly.
You mentioned that.
Oh yeah, what's the Paul
podcast
P podcast? Yeah,
he said he was shooting laser beams at the front of the rim, and if you go back and you watch any film from the second half of the season, it definitely looks like that. I think
we don't watch games around here, so that's not going to happen.
Hey, narratives only. I'm into it.
So you've been told, right?
My biggest thing I'm watching for next season is the year 1 to year 2 Chet Holmgren leap, because if you told me 2, maybe 3 seasons from now that this team stays intact, but Chet Holmgren is the best player on the team with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, I wouldn't be shocked at all.
All right, well, let's get into that a little bit then. So what you kind of mentioned what that could look like, but if you're going to use Kevin Durant as the analog, if you're trying to like sort of zero in on the type of usage that we think will change from Chet Holmgren, like if it's just like a shot type he incorporates or a play type, you mentioned 4-5 pick and rolls. I guess my first question would be, do you actually think that he has the handle or the ability to develop the handle that would empower him to do all of this stuff, where it's like the stuff that Kevin Durant can do with the ball in his hands. He's not Kyrie Irving or Steph Curry with the ball, but like he can navigate traffic, I would say, better than we've seen from Chet. Maybe that's a matter of opportunity, but do you believe in the handle to that degree where it's not just a matter of creating for himself, but you're talking about initiating offense for others at that point?
Is he there now? No. Will he be there year 2? Probably not. Can he get there over the course of the next 3 to 4 years? I think so. I think back to the playoff series where the Thunder played the Los Angeles Clippers, and the Clippers' game plan was let Chris Paul guard Kevin Durant. Doesn't matter that there's an 8-inch height difference there. Chris was able to get under the handle because KD's handle was so long from hand to floor and a little bit looser, and KD's really tightened that handle up. I think it'll be a process for Chet. I think he can get there, and I think that's the style of play he wants to play and that the Thunder want him to do offensively. So I think it'll be a work in progress for sure, but I think it'll get there. Now, again, not saying he's going to be Kevin Durant. I want to make that abundantly clear.
Aggregators, Jacob Niffen thinks that
Dan's going to clip this and put it all over the HardwoodKnocks socials.
Actually, it is going to be a clip for a larger project, but it'll be out there. So is there then, what is something then specific? Like if you're looking at kind of like, if you look at his shot diet this year, and then if you had to compare it to next year, like what's one area that you would like to see more of them, Jacob? Is it kind of like you mentioned, the pull-ups? Is it maybe he had like kind of at points, like he shot really well on floaters last year? Is it, I'm not a fan of, let's give the ball to him in the post, but maybe developing a turnaround or being able to have more face-up opportunities inside the arc, and not to compare him to Kristaps, but like the ability to just like catch the ball, turn around, face up, and be like, oh, fuck, I'm taller than everybody, I'm just going to shoot this.
Yeah, so the one biggest spot is 3-point attempts.
That's what I had, Jacob. No,
he
agree
took
completely.
4.3 last year. I'm going to be real honest with you. If he takes like 7 this year, I think that's a really good sign.
Well, they could use someone who takes that many. For a team that paces the floor so well, they don't. Didn't you guys were the ones that I know this from? Only one player took 5 3-point attempts per game last year. My God.
And that was Lou Dort.
Not Isaiah Joe.
Noted sniper, Lou Dort.
I think you're going to see those attempts start to climb for a handful of those guys. But for Chet specifically, I think off the dribble threes, trail, transition threes, I could see them running some like pin down type of actions and like coming up from the corner type of actions. And then he also has, you kind of mentioned the idea of like not posting him up, but when he catches in that high post area, he actually has a really nice like little turnaround midi fadeaway. He almost goes to like the Dirk, like high knee fadeaway. And I think you could see that a lot more as well. He's got really, really good touch. And like I said, I think last year he ran out of gas. You could just tell the legs were dead. He wasn't getting any arc in his shot at all. I think another offseason, having the full season under his belt really starts to fix some of that stuff. And hey, maybe he takes Paul George's advice and shoots with like a, what'd Paul say, like a heavy pound basketball or something like that?
The weighted basketball. I like it.
I mean, Paul George had like a shit ton of shoulder issues, so I hope Chet can.
That's kind of where mine went to.
And that was Chet's response to him too, which I found pretty hilarious.
Did he say that?
He was like,
your shoulder?
Not specifically, but he alluded to it. He was like, dude, like, what does that do to your shoulders? And I was like, that was pretty good.
Go look at his game logs, Chet.
Yeah, that's right. You'll find out real quick. Jacob, your first two questions, or your first two answers to Dan's questions, I think were pretty spot on. And you touched on a lot that I have like more specifics on. I think as we go later on through the outline that Dan gave us and some really fun things to talk on. Dan, I apologize. I'm like kind of taking over host duties here. And as Jacob knows from our podcast, I do that way too often. But
you're welcome.
I will just say, yeah, just back to like the big takeaway you had, Jacob. I love that you mentioned that because I kind of want to take it a step further. And I had two quick ones, but my main one, and I kind of call it the low-hanging fruit, but it's not just Chet for me and his improvement. It's the big three in OKC in general, Dan. Shea, Dub, Chet. I know Shea, was second in MVP voting. Seems like he's a top 5 player in the league consensus. If you ask around, look to all these national media podcasts and articles that they have out there, but he has a lot of growth as well as a player. And so how did these players continue to work on their own games and improve? Like, obviously we want to see J-Dub take a big leap. Jacob just crushed talking about Chet and the leap we want to see from him. How do they do that but still play alongside one another and also within the construct of the team. And let's make it very clear, none of us here in OKC are worried about personalities or these players not wanting to do so. That's not them at all. They want to play within the construct of what Mark Daigneault and Sam Presti have envisioned for this team. More so just them being also incredibly talented and still have so much room for growth. How are they all able to do that together? And that just kind of leads to my final big takeaway for the season is you have these new big additions, like we're about to get into with Alex Caruso as a Hartenstein, plus playoff experience now under this young team's belt, plus the superstar in Shea and the rising stars that we just mentioned. That equals new expectations. And look, let's be very clear. The Thunder preach about not listening to the outside noise, but just know that it's impossible not to hear those things. And so how does this Thunder team, this young Thunder team, how do they perform in comparison to those external expectations?
It does seem, though, that because one of my questions that doesn't need to be a question anymore based on how you guys think that they're going to use Chet is, do they miss the Josh Giddey Chet connection at all? Just because Giddey did a good job of actively looking for him, especially when you look at the share of the passes he threw. Now you take Giddey out of the equation. That's one less person who needs the ball in their hands. Doesn't it kind of just make it, I would say, a non-concern about J-Dub and Chet and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander all being able to play kind of a starring, teams just have three guys normally that can super teams have three guys that can normally operate on ball. And a lot of the times things tend to work themselves out. And so is that if there's a player of the three that you would be concerned about, I don't want to say lost in the shuffle, but seeing their skills being tamped down, is it naturally just Chet because of the position that he technically plays, or maybe even just the defensive workload that he's shouldering, so you don't want to overtax him too much on offense? Jacob, is there it seems to me from that perspective, getting rid of Josh Giddey just takes care of a lot of any of the concern when it comes to the collective development of those three.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And you mentioned the number of passes Josh Giddey made and how many of those are going to Chet. And Josh was great at getting guys to their spots. And I think a lot of folks have this idea that Josh Giddey is a really bad player. And I just think with the rapid development of the Thunder, the fit just wasn't clean at all. I don't have the stats to back this up, Dan. This is just a he no ball quote, but I think the better connection on the team is Dub and Chet. They developed, Dub was the only guy who could complete a lob to Chet Holmgren, but they developed a really, really nice two-man game, especially with one of them attacking and the other one cutting and being able to find each other. And I think the absence of Josh Giddey opens up shots, touches, passes, opportunities specifically for those three. And I would say even more specifically for Dub and Chet. Shai's usage, I imagine, would stay the same. I don't think it's going up because of the absence of Josh. So I think those other two get even more of an opportunity. And I think putting the ball in Jalen Williams' hand, with Josh gone, I think J-Dub might be the best passer on the team. And I think you'll see a lot more offensive initiation with him as well. So I think the absence of Josh just opens up opportunities for those other two to really grow more naturally into what they want to do. Where, again, I don't think Josh is a bad player, but Josh absolutely needed the ball in his hand to succeed on this team. I think just to succeed in the NBA. And those opportunities were rapidly dwindling in OKC, but you also still wanted to play him. But if you playing him off ball, we saw how that went, right? And it wasn't good. So I think it was just a very natural transition. I actually mentioned this on our show the other day. The trading of Josh Giddey and that opening up more opportunities for Chet and for J-Dub is very similar to me 10 plus years ago when they traded Jeff Green to open up the opportunities for Serge Ibaka.
Okay.
Serge was a little more unknown at the time than these two obviously are. But they got rid of one guy to open up opportunities for another. And I see something very similar happening here with the absence of Josh.
One of the biggest storylines I guess I'm following this season is Anthony Black's assertion as a lead facilitator in that bench role and Jalen Suggs in that starter role. I'll start with AB. I think with the loss of Joe Ingles, who assumed that role last season as the offensive hub between him and Mo Wagner's two-man game, I want to see if AB can inherit that responsibility off the bench in a lead creator role. And the idea of having a surefire point guard around to set the table has become the default, I think, around the league. But I think one of the most common misconceptions is making plays isn't the same thing as running a team. I know that's been an emphasis for AB. And through a pair of summer league games this past season, I thought he did a much better job of manipulating the defense. He's reading the help side defenders a lot better than he was a season ago. And he's finding players a step late or step too slow before he's making those high-level reads. So I think all that combined with the fact that both he and Jalen Suggs saw pretty much near non-existent usage from within their offensive playbook, specifically AB. I mean, Jamal Mosley did less than the bare minimum in helping create offensive pathways for him. Even his big Dallas offensive outburst, most of AB scoring in that game came from having defend for himself versus having his number called within set plays. So I think adapting to the speed of the pro game is already a major struggle at first. And then you add seeing limited playing time, being thrust into the starting role, and then being primarily utilized to defend the opposing team's best guard, and then just not be rewarded within set plays within the flow of an already, like we mentioned, pretty barren offensive playbook. It's rough. And I know on paper he played 69 games in his rookie season, but he only saw double digit in 50 of those games, I believe. And what a point guard needs most is time, patience, the water and sunlight of chances to fail, and then the structure and the opportunity to grow. Because if we go back in time, Jalen Suggs didn't have the greatest rookie season of all time. And now you can see that Orlando's presenting confidence in Suggs to take over that lead guard role. And then I want to see if AB can be able to do that off the bench as well.
Do you think that they're going to have the time and space for Anthony Black to do that, though, when you look at a team that, and it's a very interesting storyline to focus on just because they have immediate aspirations. Like they have time just because Paolo's not on his next contract yet. Even Franz signs his extension, but that doesn't kick in. This team is young, but like you made it to the playoffs and progress, of course, isn't linear, but like the idea is it's not win more games or make it further in the playoffs than last season, but it's have a better product at the end of everything. And there's a tug of war there where it's giving Anthony Black more runway to run things on the offensive end that will go a long way. And maybe they have enough spacing around him now where they might even feel more comfortable with him doing it. But when you also are a team that's like, you're supposed to be in the playoff conversation in the East. And I think some people even probably have them penciled in like the top 5 or top 4, just based off their defensive ceiling alone. How hard is it to juggle this idea that, we want this sophomore to continue to develop at one of the most important, like functional positions in the league. But hey, we also don't necessarily have the stomach for the growing pains to just like, if he's out there and has a really bad game, can we, are we built to overcome that and let that ride?
I don't think it necessarily is. It doesn't necessarily have to be Anthony Black at the 1 and then give him the ball and everyone just get out of the way and let him create. He's a 6'7", 6'8" guard. He's a big guard, and there's a lot of things that he can do on the floor that doesn't necessarily equate to him having the ball in his hands. I mean, in that Cleveland matchup in the playoffs, Orlando ran inverted screens for Paolo Banchero 9 times. They didn't score a single point in game 1 through their inverted screen set. I mean, you put Anthony Black, and Anthony Black did a really good job of pairing with Paolo Banchero and weaponizing his ability as a screener in those inverted screen sets, in specific that game against New York at home in Orlando. And no guard on the Magic came close to sniffing more than 100 screen assists. So if you want to put Anthony Black as a primary screener for Paolo using his size, I think that in itself frees up a lot for Paolo. And one of the most common ways that he was able to do that this season, which we didn't really see a lot of because of his staggering minutes, whether he was playing or not playing, was the Magic were very successful when AB was screening for Paolo via wedge screens or pin-in screens. So I believe he's going to be critical for their potential playoff success if they want to advance and compete in the second round this season, whether that be the ball in his hands or other variations of him being involved in the offense and not just being thrust in the corner like he was last season, saying, hey, if you get the ball, just shoot it.
Do you trust, though, because that will be part of his role in certain sets, do you trust like the jumper to come along enough to where he's not? I think people sometimes confuse shooting and floor spacing, to where like floor spacing is you could be like a not so great shooter, but defenses respect you. And I think when you go back and look at Anthony Black shot well from three last year, but it was on a negligible number of attempts. And you look at the way a lot of those were defended or the situations they came in, I wouldn't call it necessarily like caps lock floor spacing. How do you feel about sort of development of his, because that's going to be whether he's on the ball, off the ball, like the jumper is going to be something that needs to be a trustworthy weapon in his arsenal.
I expect the 3-point attempts, not only for Anthony Black, but for everyone else to increase. But I know the Magic, I believe they were 27th in 3-point attempts. But when people talk about 3-point attempts, I don't want you to just chuck up shots for the sole purpose of increasing those attempts, right? One of my biggest coaching icks is coaches' refusals to draw plays for certain players. I know we haven't touched on Gary Harris today yet, but throughout the playoffs as a veteran, he shot 7 for 22. 7 for 22 as a starter, whose sole purpose for being on the Magic was to provide 3 and D. He provided the D and no 3, and not one of those plays was a drawn up play for him in those 22 attempts. I mean, he's not coming off a veer screen. He's not coming off a twist, a punch strong curl, Oklahoma, Finland, double drag. All his attempts, every single one of them, were a result of kickouts. And so going back to your point, not only for Anthony Black, for the entire team, I want the attempts to increase, but I want more of an emphasis to be drawn on drawing up plays to create advantages and space for shooters, not just stashing them in the corner and then having them receive the ball off kickouts. It just hasn't worked, and I don't believe it's going to work the more you do it.
Do you think that could maybe be a function of their lack of trust in the actual like offensive accessories on this team, to where it's the way to generate good spacing around? And I'm just going to use this guy as an example because he's the most important player on the team. But like when you go back and look at just like Paolo Banchero drives and how much or like when he's in, like how much space this dude just not have to operate, you do organically kind of stretch defenses by having guys in the corners. And if you don't trust players to either run or execute the more complicated stuff. And look, they're dealing with a young team. You know, we're talking about Anthony Black. Jalen Suggs just finished up year 3. So if you're not necessarily trusting those guys in those actions that you're outlining, it like, do you think that had to do with a level of concern or not even concern, but like we're still trying to feel out like what these young guys are going to be able to do? Or do you really think that it was just kind of like this functional cop out a little bit, that there should have been more complicated stuff being run?
Yeah, I think it's more of a functional cop-out than the alternative. And some of it, like from a half-court perspective, is that the team just wasn't, like you said, they just weren't running many complex plays to alter the defensive structure opposing teams are based in, because everyone coming into the night knew we're going to switch to blitz, Paolo and Franz, and everyone else on the corners. If they're going to beat us, they're going to beat us. We're going to live with that. But I think in a bird's eye view, I mean, pair the loss of their primary offensive play caller, Nate Tibbetts, came just a few weeks before the season had started, and he accepted a head coaching gig for the Phoenix Mercury with not a lot of time to replace him. And Jesse Mermis took over the play calling duties, and it didn't necessarily bore with leading, and it led to a lot of clunk. I mean, they don't have many secondary ball handlers either, so someone who can create their shot off the dribble, aside from Cole, Paolo, Franz, and to a degree Jalen. So if and when their primary action didn't work, you were just left with, like you mentioned, a Paolo Banchero ISO, which was another direct result of his poor efficiency. And then I think AB, Jet, and the addition of KCP helps in that regard, because I believe all 3 of those guys are connective passers. And having more guys on the floor who can create advantages and provide relief options is just good for an offense that has been non-existent for we're going on about 2 seasons now.
I feel like I've been asking everyone who comes on what the biggest storyline is for this team. Did we just tackle it? Because I feel like the easy answer would be like, how does the big 3 fit together? But Joel Embiid is still so critical to what they're doing. Is that the answer? Is it a different answer? Like, what are you kind of tracking most closely this year for this team?
Yeah, so it is the health, right? Because if they don't get to mid-April, early May with both Joel and PG healthy, then kind of we could just throw it out right now, right? Like I think both of us are pretty high on Tyrese Maxey in the league landscape, but if you're asking him to take Andre Drummond and Kelly Oubre and Caleb Martin past the second round, like that's not a reasonable ask for anyone. So the health is number one, but I do think the offshoots of how they manage Joel are probably the most fascinating thing to me, right? Like you can split it up into a bunch of different categories. One of the ones that is most interesting to me is like, what are the consequences on the court for one? You're taking all the back-to-backs off the table, allegedly. So that's 15 games off the top. No Joel. Mm-hmm. They've said they'll probably build some other, minimal rest in at some point for him. Let's call that another 5 to 10 games. So you're in the lower 60s. Let's say even if he gets through with like fairly clean bill of health, he misses another 5 to 10. So you're talking about, mid 50s, maybe mid to high 50s in a fair, not best case scenario, but a very good scenario. And with Maxey ascending and Paul George probably going to get some time off himself, what is the identity of this team? And does Maxey become the guy for long stretches of the season? And so more importantly to me, when you get to the playoffs, what is your identity? Because I think we see every year, most of the teams that are playoff resilient, that make it to, conference finals, have had the supporting cast and the stars mostly, if not all, healthy the whole year. They figure out that they run through their plays and their stuff, and they're not even thinking anymore, right? It just react. Like if it's Jokic, he knows this guy will make this cut at this time. He doesn't have to look on the pass. Anthony Edwards is running a pick and roll. He knows what his reads are. He knows where, and you just go down the list. Like Luka, same thing last year. He's got complete command of that offense. And it's just hard when Joel has said, like, Tyrese is going to be the guy this year, and I'm going to help him with that. And it's like, it's easy to say that. And I believe that he trusts him and wants to empower him in that way. But once Joel's on the floor, it's like the guy's getting the ball and the offense is running through him. And so how do you balance that idea of like, he's the guy when he's available, but he's also not going to be available for, let's call it 25 to 35% of the season, pretty much guaranteed. And is that a way to win at a high level in the playoffs? I don't know. The Raptors did it in 2019, but they got absolute apex Kawhi, and they had a ton of high-level, intelligent role players. I mean, even they got Marc Gasol at the deadline. He was, high basketball IQ. Kyle Lowry, high basketball IQ. Danny Green has won in a million places. Like, it's not easy to replicate that. And they were also fortunate in the finals that the Warriors fell apart as well.
Does that come down to Embiid making more of an adjustment than Maxey at this point? Because I think one of the things that's impressed me most about Tyrese Maxey through the first, leg of his career, he's played so many different types of roles on, like he's seen so many different iterations of the Sixers, and he's only going into year 5, that we know that he can adjust and shape shift kind of on a game basis, a lineup basis. And so, like, what is the challenge then for, like, is there a way for Joel Embiid to be, again, he's going to be central to the offense, but like, what is the path to him being more offensive complement for stretches, or coming in and maybe not disrupting some of the other elements that the Sixers have going on without him?
Well, I think the good news is that Tyrese is the most hand in glove fit of a star that he's ever played with offensively. Like, if you go back through, the start of Joel's career, he's succeeded with guys that are high level shooters that can shoot on the move, that are successful out of these like dribble handoff looks, right? So go back to JJ Redick. He was great at it. Seth Curry, who has not always had a home everywhere. He's been a great shooter, but kind of like journeyman a little bit. He was awesome in Philly, in part because Joel created space for him and they figured out that 2-man game. Well, Maxey, no disrespect to those two, a far more advanced player in a ton of different ways, way more dangerous off the dribble. And though Joel and Tyrese have figured out, all the nuances of the 2-man game out of those handoffs, and just Tyrese using his big body as a screener, Tyrese turning the corner and making the reads. Are they trapping? Are they, dropping, whatever? And I think the most important thing is Joel trusts Tyrese just blindly, right? I guess not blindly, because incredible worker, like the high character guy, has put the results on paper every single year, gets better, gets better, gets better. And I think you saw in that Knicks series, what was it, game 5 in the Garden where Maxey went for like 47. That was a game where Joel struggled for a lot of that game. And there was a very clear point in the fourth quarter where Maxey was like, it's my time. Like, I'm playing better. And Joel happily was just like, gave him the runway and said, it's your show, do that. And we saw that throughout last season, at least when Joel was healthy. So I think he wants to do whatever it's going to take to win. There will certainly be moments where Joel thinks like, I have the matchup, I'm the guy, whatever. But I do think they are so tight, both on and off the floor, that it should help make that process of figuring out, whose night is it, whose shot is it, all that easier than it probably would be otherwise.
Mike, and I want answers from both of you, assuming they're different here, but aside from Budenholzer and whatever he's going to implement, what is the biggest storyline for this team that you're going to be monitoring entering next season or throughout next season?
I mean, it has to be the addition of multiple point guards to this team, because this was a team that I think it was justifiable to not start a point guard if you start with 2 guards in Bradley Beal and Devin Booker. And the idea being that you can have both of these guys, along with Kevin Durant, handling the ball enough and creating enough for others to sort of be okay without one. But the fact that they pulled off an offseason where they added, I think, competent point guards at both the starting and backup position, I think changes things for how this team can play offensively, and even maybe has an impact defensively, if not just because of the ability to not turn it over constantly, because that's really what was the biggest problem, but maybe to have other players out there that are good at getting in the passing lanes and actually turning the other team over a little bit.
Sam, how much of an impact do you see like Tyus Jones having on this offense, even just aside from, okay, we know the assist to turnover ratio is generational, but like, is there like another area, or just like, is it general organization? Like, what type of impact do you envision him having on a team that is so loaded with, again, 3 guys who in theory can do a bunch of stuff on the ball?
Yeah, it really is just general organization, because let's be honest, in terms of both who Tyus and Monte are, they have this generational skill, and their other skills are just average. These guys are average at everything else, right? Tyus, he comes with a little bit of a floater game that's pretty good. Monte has a mid-range game as well. I'll be curious to see how much they're sort of pushing him to just fire away from threes when he comes off the bench, and maybe get away from some of the stuff that he's done in the past. But we need them for their point guard skills, because again, this was the 9th best offense in the NBA last year. And not because they shot the ball poorly from any particular spot on the floor. They had loads of good 3-point shooters. Just look at the season that Grayson Allen had, being the best 3-point shooter in the NBA at a certain volume. They had terrific mid-range shooters, terrific finishers at the rim, with the exception of Yusuf Nurkic, who's the worst finisher you've ever seen, and is maybe the most Yusuf Nurkic, who I would describe as the most frustrating net positive player I think I've ever watched, is probably what he was for the Suns last year. So yeah, we just like 9th best offense, one of the worst turnover teams in the NBA. If you just add Tyus and Monte and turn them into a top 10 team in terms of taking care of the ball, how many points right there, if we consider it like a math formula, how many points can you add to your offensive rating? 2, 3, 4? Like, it feels like there's a real pathway there for them to get into the top 5 as an offensive team, which is what they need to be if they want to hit their ceiling. Now, what's it going to do for their defense and their defensive versatility and their rebounding and all of these other things? We can quibble about that, but yeah, these guys are going to be huge for the organization.
I think what helps though is that by not turning the ball over and not giving, teams extra opportunities or opportunities in transition, I think they were bottom 10 defensively after committing a turnover. And so that could help your defense by extension.
Absolutely.
But my question to you, Mike, what does this do by having Tyus Jones in there? And we're looking at the core lineups of it all, where you have Beal and Booker and Kevin Durant. Those are, you could stretch it if you want to with the definition of wing and use Devin Booker and or Kevin Durant. But we're talking about 4 non-wings who could be a part of their core lineup without getting to a big man first. Like, what does it have a sort of trickle down effect with? One, maybe there's a concern from you guys about what their core lineups look like. Does it portend some type of unique or heavy staggering? Could we see one of those guys and probably Tyus, or could we see like a Bradley Beal maybe not on the floor during certain crunch times? Like, what is just the trickle down effect of having so many important non-wings on this team?
Yeah, it's interesting. The crunch time thing is a conversation that we just had recently on the podcast, in that you could see a scenario where Tyus doesn't play in the last few minutes of a game, right? And then you have the big three on there, maybe with Grayson and Nurkic, or some version of somebody off the bench. Maybe it's Royce O'Neal, even for a little extra defense, or maybe Bol. Who knows? Sam's favorite player.
We'll get there.
Coming in and playing with size, but they were, and they repeated this a lot anytime the Suns played on ESPN or TNT. They were the worst team plus minus wise in the last 5 minutes of close games in the entire NBA last season, and a big part of that was due to turnovers. It's hard to say that they brought a point guard that doesn't turn it over to this team, and they're going to sit him when the game is very important,
especially when he signed for so little too.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt too, but like,
no, absolutely, it's just true. So it does have somewhat of a trickle down effect. We even had the conversation of, would this team be better? And look, don't get me wrong, it's the middle of the summer, so we needed to come up with podcast topics, but we did have the conversation on our podcast of, does Bradley Beal need to come off the bench? Now, there's no way that that's going to happen. There's no way. But just coming up with ideas or thoughts on how this could potentially work, that is something that has to pop in your head at some point in thinking about this team. Because in some ways, it's Tyus Jones and you have 2 shooting guards, and then you have Kevin Durant, who plays like a 7-foot shooting guard. So it's like 3 shooting guards and a big on the floor. And I think it's gonna be troubling. It's hard to picture a team that's this small or plays this way being a contender. I mean, not to jump to any sort of future topic here, but it's hard to picture that.
If egos and contract considerations and all that didn't exist, and we could just arrange this like a 2K rotation, it certainly feels like Tyus Jones and maybe Grayson Allen in the backcourt, and then you've got Booker and KD and Nurkic, fits together as a bunch of puzzle pieces who play the right roles. And then you use Bradley Beal as he gets his 30 minutes per game, but it's off the bench as a microwave scorer and doesn't necessarily have to close games. Again, is that going to happen? No. We're just posing that if all of this other stuff didn't exist, if Budenholzer didn't have to consider feelings, doesn't it feel like, Dan, and you can disagree, but doesn't it feel like maybe that would just fit a little bit better?
No, it absolutely fit better. If there wasn't any like politicism involved here, like with what Mike Budenholzer has to do, I think that's completely logical that you would think that that's their best setup. And if it's not, or if they feel beholden to, we have to play all 3 of our stars or our highest paid players, and then we want Tyus out there, could they find themselves like relying more than, I think Mike or both you just mentioned, they don't want to lean on Kevin Durant or no big lineups, let's call them, but do you become more dependent on those lineups because you have to figure out a way to fit all of those guys into the fold, while then also like, well, we want like someone who's considered sort of a wing checker out there.
And you know what it does more than anything else? It makes the trade deadline and Grayson Allen really interesting for this team, because Grayson Allen, I love him, and he was really good on the Suns last year. And I know there's a lot of negative publicity out there for Grayson Allen, and some of it deserved, but he was really great on the Suns last year. But he also plays the same position as Devin Booker and Bradley Beal. Mm-hmm. And they need some sort of positional versatility on this team. He signed a contract. He can't be traded for another few weeks, but he can be traded throughout the season. And if the Suns can find a trade that makes sense, where they can add real wing depth to this team, or even someone worthy of starting as a wing player, it'd be hard to turn that down. If it makes sense for this team this year, it has to make sense this year.
They do also have, just to remind people, because I know you know this, Dan, but maybe others don't, they have an open roster spot now, right? So it feels like they're going into the season. I think the likelihood that they make a trade in the next few weeks is very unlikely, but going into the season, there's a reason that the Suns have an open roster spot. They're thinking about February already, and maybe some of the moves that they could make.
What is your biggest storyline that you'll be kind of tracking throughout this season for the team? Dunks, the number of dunks, is that what?
No. So it all kind of leads, like, there's the tracking the player improvement. What is, what's Scoot's potential? What's Shaden's potential? What combos work the best? Like I said earlier, when do the vets get traded? I'm still wondering if they have a good coach. And I'm continuing to look at, and I want to know who's going to be the coach at the end of the season. This is the coach's fourth year. At the end of this year, there's a team option, but he's got to be miserable. Chauncey Billups was hired to coach Damian Lillard, and he's been thrown into this completely different position. He's now like, what's his record? It's like 81 and 165. And like,
rough.
Does he? I can't imagine that he's happy having to do this. And so I'm watching to like, are they getting better because it's just natural growth and they're a year older? Or are they getting better because they're being put into situations where they're learning the game and they're applying it on the field and they're running plays that are recognizable? And so, yeah, one of the big things I'm tracking is who's going to be the coach at the end of the season.
Honestly, that's really thought provoking, because I'm trying to think of the last coach who, even if they were a first timer, had a job for 3 seasons. And we were kind of left asking like, well, what is his calling card, or what is his guiding principle? And you have that question with Chauncey. I guess the pushback would be how much of that is on him, because while we view this as year 2 of the post-Dame rebuild, like you kind of had 2 years beforehand of just, wandering through the wilderness, as everyone calls it.
Well, and they haven't been trying. They've been trying for 3 years to get lottery picks.
Yeah.
So it's like, what are they going to do if they get rid of him? Lose? I mean, it's like, it's kind of a like no lose situation, on the one hand, but it's like, how good is it for everybody's, okay, so here's the thing I think about a lot. Donovan Clingan just won 2 national championships with one of the best coaches in college ball. And here he comes to Portland, a team that is not trying to win games. They're trying to win in other ways.
Right.
And Donovan Clingan's coming off of 2 national championships and excellent coaching into this situation. And I know that high draft picks often go into a situation like this, but often it's like with the team that still like has an identity in a way they're going. And I really worry, like, I think I'm super excited about Donovan Clingan, and I don't want him to get discouraged having come off of, back-to-back national championships. Like, he's a winner. He's used to winning. And he's coming to a team. I'm sorry, I'm going off on my thing that this is
no, you're good.
That the 3 players who I love these guys, but the 3 players who the Blazers are looking hardest at building around. So let's start with Anthony Simons. Didn't play college ball. He did a year at IMG, and then he came in to Portland and had a couple of years where they were trying to win. And now the last 3 years has gone, or 2 seasons, 3 seasons has gone through what he's been through. Scoot played for 2, not just 1 year on the Ignite, 2 years on the Ignite, starting when he was 17, a team that does not have a winning record.
No.
Shaden didn't play in college. He attended practice, but he didn't play. And now here comes Donovan Clingan into this situation. And I worry about that a lot. And people assure me that is not something to worry about. But I want to make sure Donovan Clingan gets the coaching that he is used to. And I want all the other guys to benefit from it too. And I'm just waiting to see that.
Yeah, I don't think people think about that enough, because everyone's so invested in, I guess, like the quantifiable, and that the culture and like that impact that you're kind of just laying out, you can't really quantify that. And so, but it's important. Like it is. That's why these teams, I'm not necessarily in favor of it. Like, you don't need to keep Udonis Haslem for 12 years to take up like one of your last roster spots. But that's why these teams have these kind of veteran guys that are actually on the roster spots, because they want to set like an important tone. And I'm also wondering if that, and this is all stream of conscious because you thought about this, which is just a great point. And I'm guilty of it. I'm not giving it much thought. But But where we might be criticizing, and I'm sure I have, it's like, well, like, why are some of these guys still on this team? Why did they keep Malcolm Brogdon for a full year? It's like, well, that might be why. It's so that these young players can come up in like the right environment. And there are people who I do wonder how to square. Like Jeremy Grant's actually a really good example, because when you look at Malcolm Brogdon, he was traded to Portland, and he's not necessarily at a point in his career where he might want to play that role. But like Jeremy Grant chose to stay. And I know Dame was technically still on the team at the time, but like he had to be eyes fairly wide open. And so having him there and just like kind of understand, like just to have high character guys around you while you're losing, I would think that's super important, especially if, as you note, like we don't really know how valuable the coach is from that perspective too.
Yeah, and I think all these guys can be great players, and I don't want to say that they're not like skilled and, you know, coachable, and they've all like shown some improvement over their last years. But that experience of either playing overseas or with a college team where you're playing for something,
yeah,
and then they come here somewhere where they're still not trying to win, and it's like that's why I'm like, okay, win the in-season tournament, play all the vets. 4 games. What is it going to cost them? Possibly 4 wins. Okay, like I can live with 4 wins. play them just so that they can be in that hype scenario. Like last season's in-season tournament game that the Blazers won. They won the first in-season tournament game, and it was so fun for the fans because it was like the stakes were not high, but it did mean something. So let these players who haven't necessarily been lately on teams that were playing something, let them at least play for the in-season tournament.
Honestly, I hope a team like the Blazers win. Like, I would just love a random team to win the in-season tournament, because that would just be really cool. Whether it's the Blazers or like the Pistons or something, it would just be, I think that'd be a great story. So when you look at moving into this season, I've been asking everyone so that they can take wherever they want what their biggest storyline is that they're tracking. But I feel like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'd be interested on a pitch that's not this answer, but it's clearly just, what is DeMar DeRozan's fit going to be, or how does it look with this team, right? And so where are you sort of at on all that? So just the move itself, like what was your reaction to that?
I was thrilled with the move. I mean, I think it's a great move overall, especially when you look at the cost of, you know, what the Kings gave up to get DeMar DeRozan. I mean, he is still an excellent player, even at his age. He's really good, and he brings to the table a lot of the things that the Kings were missing last year, some of the things that caused the offense to stall out. You know, so he really solves a lot of their issues as far as needing another creator, needing someone else who can find another shot, giving them another option in the clutch. Like, it just makes them so much harder to scheme against in just one way. It gives them a lot more looks. So I'm really excited about it. And I don't feel like giving up Harrison Barnes and Chris Duarte is really very much to give up. And I think how people evaluated the loss of Harrison Barnes told me a lot this summer about who was watching the Kings and who wasn't, because there were some interesting takes flying around there. But for what it cost, and the Kings still have, you know, they didn't give up any first round picks. They still have Kevin Huerter,
Shout out Bulls.
Yeah, so good job, Bulls. So I mean, they still have the tools to make another move. I was hoping they would do another move this summer, but you know, even if it's at the deadline or whenever it might be, the Kings still have the ammunition to do another move. They didn't spend every trade asset under the sun just to get DeMar DeRozan. If they had done that, I would have been a little bit more down on it. But for what it cost the team, I think it's a fantastic move. Now, there are obviously questions with it, and I think some of those questions are valid. You know, what's the defense going to look like? You know, how does the ball get distributed? Because now you've got a lot of guys who like the ball in their hand. I think those are good problems to have. They are things that I'm curious to see how they'll work out. But overall, I think it's a good move.
Well, looking at the positive, is there one, you mentioned all that he does. Is there one thing though that like you think will end up being the most impactful, even if it's just like, you know, their free throw attempt rate plummeted last year, and like if you're not going to get to the rim, and they weren't getting to the rim as often either, to get someone from DeRozan who, yeah, he's not going to get to the basket a ton, but the dude still just draws fouls. It doesn't fucking matter.
And that's huge. I mean, the Kings last year, their leading free throw attempts per game was De'Aaron Fox at 5.7, and DeRozan gets last year was at like 8.7, I think 8.2, something like that. It was in the 8s. So like, he is far and away their best at getting to the line, drawing fouls. You know, which helps you with then getting your opponent in foul trouble. And he actually makes his free throws, which the Kings also really struggled with last year. So, he not only will get to the line, but actually makes some of those. That plus just that ability to create his own shot in isolation. The Kings didn't have a lot of that. I mean, Monk sometimes, Fox sometimes. That was about it. No one else on that team was creating their own shot in isolation, and not to the level that DeRozan can.
Are we going to see dribble handoffs run between DeRozan and Sabonis in the paint? I just feel like they're gonna be that low when they run it. I need to see it. I hope so too. That's what I don't know if that'll be the biggest impact. That's the thing I want to see the most. If you have what would be your biggest concern if you had to isolate it down about the fit? What would be the potential biggest wart for you?
I would probably go with the defense. I mean, I do think that the defensive criticism against DeRozan is maybe a little overblown, because when you look at defensive ratings and stuff like that, which obviously has a lot of team noise in there as well, but DeRozan had a better defensive rating than Harrison Barnes last year. Again, Harrison Barnes was not in any way a plus defender, and so I don't know that swapping DeRozan for Barnes, I don't know how much that hurts the defense. I do think that it can cause issues depending on certain matchups. So I'm curious to see what that impact is. But I'm also kind of excited because if the Kings go back to being an elite offense and can stay a middle of the pack defense as opposed to a bottom of the pack defense, that's a pretty exciting team, and I'll be excited to root for that.
I guess, was that the take where I'm just so far removed from that silo, I guess, that they thought the Kings were losing an elite defender in Harrison Barnes or something? Is that what the perception was?
There were some pundits that were talking about how much the Kings were going to miss Harrison Barnes' defense.
I actually think DeRozan is worse defensively than last year's version of Harrison Barnes, just because you have to go to greater lengths you have to insulate Harrison Barnes too, but the stuff that they asked him to do was just oh, you shouldn't be doing that. Where it's with DeRozan, no, he can't. I just don't know. And in Chicago, to his point, was defensive rating, he got to share the floor with Alex Caruso at points.
Yeah, absolutely.
There. So, but I don't think it's when you look at I looked at it as, I don't know if it's a perfect offensive fit, but DeMar DeRozan is an elite offensive player, which Harrison Barnes, if he ever was one, that's just not him. And so in talent, to me, it was a very clear upgrade. And I think I over romanticize swaps. That was the thing that gave me pause. That swap is really far away. And it's we want teams that are good to go for it now, and to give up a swap for DeMar DeRozan, who's still all-star caliber, you want to throw him in that vein, it is a perfectly reasonable cost. So that I'm totally on board with the move. Who do you think will benefit most on this team, though, from him being here?
That is a good question. As far as who he compliments the most?
Either compliments or makes their job easier. It's De'Aaron Fox going to take more catch and shoot open threes or something rather than having to work so hard for his own shot. Could be something like that.
I definitely think it helps Fox the most, because it's going to do two things. One, DeRozan is still a willing passer and can find Fox for kickouts or whatever else. But I think more than anything, it gives you another option that the defense absolutely has to respect and pay attention to. I think there are some concerns about the spacing because DeRozan's not a deep threat, but I do think that, especially we saw in late game situations, teams would just zero in on Fox, knowing that that's where the ball's going. It's Fox or Monk, and you don't really have to guard anyone else too close. And just one more, especially late game, close situation option who is deadly efficient, that I think opens up a lot of possibilities in a close game. I think that taking some of that pressure off of Fox as being the guy who has to save the team if they're down to, that's a huge help, I think.
Do you think, this is totally anecdotal, DeMar DeRozan probably has the prettiest jumper of anyone who sucks at hitting threes? I'm just trying to think who has the aesthetics on their jumper like he does that's not been a good 3-point shooter.
Ben McLemore. Most beautiful release I've ever seen, and he betrayed us. I mean, I've got that one off the dome, but yeah.
So when you look at the big three trio, whatever you want to call it, Who do you think ends up having to make the most adjustments, though, because DeRozan's in town? The easy answer might just be DeRozan himself because he's the one joining a new team. But whose game do you see having to adapt the most because of the way the Kings are set up right now?
I think it's going to be interesting. I think it's actually going to be fairly spread across all of them.
Okay.
I think you're going to see like Sabonis will probably take fewer shots. Fox will probably take fewer shots. Like Monk and Herter probably, like if everyone's taking a shot or two less per game, that gives you DeRozan shots, and he might be taking a shot or two less than he did before as well. I think it's going to be kind of an impact across the board, which could impact some of the counting stats, and then people will be like, "Oh, look, it's worse," or it hurt this guy. But if I had to focus in on one guy though, that I think is kind of the obvious candidate who would be negatively impacted, at least in his role on offense, is going to be Keegan Murray. He kind of goes from being, like the third or fourth option to being the fourth or fifth option offensively, which I think is a fair concern. But I also think that it allows him to be opportunistic, and that's how they used him in his rookie year, and he was fantastic. Is just like, all right, I can just sit here and hit open threes when the defense forgets about me. Like, that's cool. And he obviously showed a lot of development in his offense last year and ability to, kind of create his own shot. And I think long term, getting to like learn from DeRozan and practice with him every day and kind of see how he creates shots, I think that'll be beneficial long term. But I think this season probably see a little step back, at least offensively, from Keegan Murray.
If you can't tell, I'm still thinking a lot about this move months later. What like type of staggering patterns between the top players would you anticipate to have? Whereas I viewed it in terms of, I initially thought, Fox might spend the most time independent of Sabonis and DeRozan, but then I'm like, like you have the Sabonis like Monk chemistry, so it'll really be Sabonis maybe independent of the two. Like, I'm assuming there'll be some trial and error that they'll try different stuff out, but if you had to anticipate anything on that front, what would it be?
Yeah, that's going to be the big question. I don't know what that's going to look like. Mike Brown was pretty rigid with his rotations last season, but DeRozan's a pretty big piece to then work into those. And so I'm really curious to see how that staggering works. I would not be surprised at all if we do see kind of a stagger where when Fox is coming off, Monk is going in, especially earlier in games, because Monk can still move the ball around, good distributor, but also a scoring threat. So I think Fox and Monk will play sparingly together throughout games, but will likely be in their late games still. But yeah, I'm very curious to see. I mean, I think the tricky part is that right now you're kind of penciling in DeRozan as basically the small forward, in the lineups, and they've got a lot of options that can play one or two and not a lot of options at the three. So I don't know how much the guard staggering is going to impact or be tied to DeRozan.
But I wanted to ask you this, because I dictate too much of how the order of events goes on these podcasts. What is the single biggest storyline development, whatever, that you will be monitoring with this team into next season?
Yeah, and I hate to do this because I think Spurs fans are probably tired of me talking about Devin Vassell a little bit, but I really want to see, does Devin Vassell have that next little bit in the tank to make a jump to be something like a Chris Middleton to Giannis Antetokounmpo, right? Like, does he have that in him to be that caliber of player, right? Obviously, the Spurs would have to have a lot better players around them to win a championship, but can he be the equivalent of what Chris Middleton has been for Giannis, especially when they were competing and when they ultimately won that 2021 title? Is that the right year? Sometimes I, forget the years off the top of my head, but can he do that? Like, does he have the, I guess the skill, the bandwidth to be able to make that next jump? And I think he does. I think he might, but it's yet to be seen, right? It's yet to be seen, but I think he showed a lot of promising signs last season. I think he's somebody we're going to talk about, but for me, that's what I'm monitoring, because I think aside from Chris Paul really benefiting Wembanyama and a lot of the other shooters on this team, he's probably going to benefit, Devin Vassell long-term as well. Like, I think he can learn a lot from Chris Paul.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about it. I love Devin Vassell. I thought he improved incrementally, basically across the board last year, and because it wasn't a monster leap in any one area, it flew under the radar. I thought the handle was better. We've talked about his defense in the past. I thought that was better. I think a part of that is Victor Wembanyama exists, so that just makes things easier on everybody. And then just like, even if the efficiency was down in some areas, the level of shots that he is capable of taking and making now, like if you rewind back to his rookie season, I don't know if I ever would have predicted that he got to this point. And so I have two main questions on this, but I guess the first one is, so if he's going to make that leap to, we call it the Chris Middleton like status, but just like, oh, number 2 guy on a contender, what is it that you're looking to see him improve upon or develop? What area most?
Yeah, I think he's got to continue to get to the rim more often. Like he upped his rim volume last season, and he also significantly raised his field goal percentage inside the paint and inside the restricted area. Like that was huge, but the volume wasn't raised that much, right? Like he was getting there a little bit more and he was way more efficient. Now, can he get there a lot more and maintain that efficiency? And then can he get to the line a little bit more? Like, can he get to the line a little bit more? Can he leverage now getting to the rim more often to create for his teammates a little bit more? Because he did what I think he had like about 3.5 assists per game last season. Most of those were pretty rudimentary reads. It wasn't anything too advanced. It was like he was hitting guys who were, a man away, or he's hitting the roller with, a pocket pass occasionally. It wasn't anything that you're like, wow, this guy's really like capable of carrying an offense for a long time. It was more like, yeah, he can make the right pass when that presents itself. And I think all of those things kind of culminating together, can that happen? I think that's my big question. Can that happen? Because I think that's what needs to happen for him to take that next step in his progression to becoming that all-star caliber player who can be maybe a number 2 to Wembanyama.
And I'm wondering if just by organically proving the spacing, because Victor Wembanyama is better, you have Harrison Barnes, who's at least more of a threat from beyond the arc, if that allows him to get to the rim more, because it feels like sometimes it does just feel like he bails out on his drives and might prefer the mid-range look. But other times it's just kind of like, well, you look at the way the defenses are guarding the Spurs, and that's why he gets rid of the ball. Like I think his pass percentage on drives was absurd last year. It was like 40% or something ridiculous like that. And so I'm just wondering if the floor being more open, if that helps him get to the basket. But he has always had that element of his game where it does feel like his drives are just, when he's on the ball, like it might stall out before it has to. Like he might settle before he needs to.
Yeah, and I definitely think that he's limited in some way. And I like the Chris Middleton comparison that I threw out there. I'm not saying that's like a 1-for-1. They're definitely not the same player. But as far as like biomechanically, they don't have a ton of wiggle, right? They don't have a ton of burst. They rely on pace, change of pace. A lot of their, pull-ups are like those 1-2 dribble pull-ups. They're not really like east and west guys. They're north-south. And even in being north-south, they're not truly like blow by speed, right? That's not who they are. They're going to beat you being patient. They're going to get to their spot. They're going to create space with a couple dribbles, and then they're going to rise. So like, I think that's definitely a limiting factor for him. Like he's never, I think, going to be a better athlete than he is right now. I mean, he's not getting younger. Nobody else in the league is getting younger, right? Like, so I think that's a limiting factor for him, but I still don't think that it is such a limiting factor that he can't take another step. Like we've seen players who are not necessarily the best athletes adjust, whether it's, adding a little bit of muscle to their frame, being a little bit more patient, using a change of pace, ball fakes. Like, I just want to see, can he do that? I'm not 100% sure. I think he can, but again, it's yet to be seen, and we'll just have to wait till next season when he's out on the court and potentially having better spacing. Could that help him? Yeah, I think it could help him, but in the same breath, I don't know that it's going to be that much better. I think it really depends on who's around him, who ends up being the starters.
And how do you think his role, if at all, and I'm assuming it will change with Chris Paul in San Antonio now? Because I think the burden on him gets less. And I think Chris Paul did a better job last year of maybe getting off the ball more quickly than we're used to. But relative to Trey Jones, in theory, if Chris Paul's running your offense, he's a lot of times not going to get off the ball as quickly as a Trey Jones. And so what does that maybe do to, I don't want to say necessarily his usage rate, but the type of usage we're going to see from Devin Vassell next season?
Yeah, I think maybe we'll see a lot more catch and shoot opportunities for a guy like Devin Vassell. I know they gave him a lot of freedom, like a longer leash to be this guy who can create off the dribble a little bit. And so even though I said, he's not really an east to west guy, they definitely let him occasionally pound the air out of the rock. I don't think we're going to see that next season so much. I think it is going to be a lot more of those, catch, if a guy's closing out too hard, 1-2 dribble, pull up. I think we're going to see a lot more of that out of Devin Vassell than hey, Dev, when Victor's not in the game with you, we're going to ask you to do a lot more. I don't think he's going to be asked to do quite as much on-ball creation as he was a year ago. So I'm not 100% sure that's going to be a case, but that certainly feels like that's what's going to end up happening, especially you would have to assume Chris Paul's starting. He already said, like, I didn't come to San Antonio to just be a mentor and come off the bench. Like, we know he's probably going to be starting from day one.
Look, he's already putting more pressure on them than Wemby ever has, and Chris Paul's been there for like a minute. This question, because I know this is actually your first look ahead that you've done with us, but I dictate too much of the terms of this podcast, so I've been asking everyone, and this team fascinates me from this perspective because I don't know what your answer is going to be, and I pride myself in kind of like being able to telegraph what the answer is going to be. What is the Raptors' biggest storyline that you're going to be tracking throughout this season?
So I think initially, when I'm going to cheat, I'm going to talk myself into the answer, and I'll give small answers until I figure it out. So I think the initial first one is like the 5th starter, because they pay a lot for their starting lineup. Jakob Poeltl has a full contract, a full fat contract. Emmanuel Quickley, full fat contract. RJ Barrett, full fat contract. Scotty Barnes, not yet. It's like 10.5 this year, but it becomes full fat contract. It's signed. You sealed, delivered. Grady, Davion, Ochai, it leans one way if you want to be future facing. But Grady, and I've watched camp. I was in Montreal with them. I watched the preseason game. There's a lot of things that have been going well for him. And his teammates are lauding his effort. But the defense is not really there yet. So there's things. You could go another way. That's the first thing. But the overall storyline is, I think, similar to what a lot of superstars, not stars, superstars go through, is year 3, year 4, you start seeing how far Sisyphus can push the boulder up the hill. And that's kind of what I'm focusing on, because I think Scotty determines the ceiling of this team.
Right.
Because you look at it like RJ, Emmanuel, you look at Grady, the guys who are considered have higher potential on this team. Which of those guys could take the number 1 spot? None, really. And I hate doing the number 1, number 2, number 3 thing, but which of them could take the number 2 spot? That's also pretty murky.
Yeah.
So Scotty solidifying that ceiling is like, okay, we have a 1 or we have a 2, and then we can build out from there. Easy peasy. That has to be determined. That helps set the ceiling and the floor of this team, and it's by far the most important thing that can keep happening, because stars are important in the NBA, as it turns out.
You know, I haven't given that much thought, because I just assume I try to find, first of all, I try to find synonyms so I don't have to use, the best player on the best team. Like the guiding light for this rebuild feels like it's clearly Scotty Barnes. I haven't really thought about, well, do they have the number 2 in place? And so if I'm forcing you to choose, do you, one, think that they do potentially have the second best player on the next really good iteration of the Raptors? And if they do, is it more likely to be RJ Barrett or Emmanuel Quickley? Is there a dark horse in there? We're not talking. Is Jamal Shed just coming in hot?
Jamal Shed is coming in hot, but not for the second best player on the team. I think I go against the grain here, because everybody was really excited for IQ right after the trade, and I held on to the RJ thing, and it went really well. And IQ, the defense didn't really come out in the wash. That everyone, he's clever off ball. I don't care if anybody ever tells me again that a guard is like a clever off ball guy. I don't care anymore. Like, it doesn't, I feel like that people just say that hoping that you haven't watched the guard, and that,
So why are you anti Shai Gilgeous-Alexander? Is this like, are we unloading it?
Because Shai does a lot of other things. He scores 30 points per game. He can be overrated on defense. That's fine. Or underrated. It doesn't matter. But IQ, the defense didn't come out in the wash. The lower pickup point on the jumper, the slow release, the want to always go right into a jumper. I think that kind of stuff limited his ability to scale. We'll see if he's able to overcome that stuff. But RJ just started scaling. Like he climbed the wall. He was like, yep, I'm first man over. Boom. He went for it. And RJ, I think there's a lot of stuff that he can clean up. And I think there's still a lot of stuff he can add to his game. And he has a willingness, I wrote this in the piece where I talked about his cutting, to punch the A gap like a fullback. And I love his willingness to get in there. And it's kind of like that power forward thing where so many power forwards of the past who used to chip in like 12 or 14 points a game just by being gritty, being in the right spot, and being comfortable with physicality. RJ kind of does that from the 2 or the 3. So he finds his way to impact, and they have to figure out how to make it easier on the other side of the floor for him. But Emmanuel wasn't good either. So I think, very long answer, I think RJ is more likely to be the 2. However, I think it's more likely that RJ is a 3.
So then your assumption would be like this team probably has to go out and find
at some point.
Yeah.
At some point. So if guiding light is 1, what is the synonym for 2? Supplementary light.
Yeah, supplementary light, the backdrop. I have no idea.
Yes,
We're gonna need a synonym for the number 2.
Mm.
I've been asking everyone this, but from what you kind of said at the top, it makes me think that the answer could be sort of a default. Is the biggest storyline you're tracking for this team, like how does it get to the bottom 5 spot that it wants when you look at the coach that they have, and then even some of just the talent that I would say is outsized relative to those, like having Markkanen and Clarkson and Sexton, and even someone like Kessler, and potentially if Taylor Hendricks gets even better from last year? Or is there something else that's like kind of the biggest storyline you'll be looking at?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I mean, the obvious answer is yes, right? Like, I think that's fascinating, because, and I'll tell you why. I watched the Jazz on Tuesday night against the Sacramento Kings, and both of those teams played a regular NBA game. They played, their regular rotation, all 48 minutes. Both of those, they both played hard. They weren't. It wasn't like Denver last night on Thursday night. I'm sure you watched the game, but we love Nikola Jokic, but he was doing cardio out there. He was just on a treadmill out there, and it wasn't that between the Jazz and the Kings on Tuesday. That was a real NBA game, and that 48 minutes that I was watching the Jazz, the only thought I had was, oh my God, this team can win 38 games. That was literally the only, I mean, I tweeted it. I'm sure you saw the tweet, but I tweeted it, and I was just like, yeah, this team can win 35 to 38 games as is. And, that's probably 12 to 15 games too many, right? So, I think one of the things that, you can count on is that this version of the Western Conference that we're about to walk into this year is really deep and really good. So somebody has to lose games, and, paper dictates that it's probably the Jazz and the Portland Trail Blazers. But man, when you have Markkanen and you have Sexton and you have Keontae George, I think Keontae George looks a lot better. And you have Taylor Hendricks at the 4 and Walker Kessler at the 5. Like, there's a lot of size and there's a lot of length, and there's dynamic ball handling in Colin Sexton, and there's just a lot to work with there. And the Jazz are going to lose games, because they're not on paper as good on paper as about probably around at least 10 to 11 other teams in the Western Conference. But, the fact that they play hard from night to night, the fact that they're not going to be a pushover, it leads me to believe, how does this team get to 25 wins? It's like, so, if I'm dubbing the Utah Jazz this season, how do you hustle in reverse, right? Like, how do you take a team that's probably too talented for 25 wins and get it to 25 wins? And I think that's probably a fascinating thing to watch.
It feels like if they end up being not even better than expected, but on pace for too many wins, or like, I think the biggest mistake some teams make, or maybe it's not a mistake, but they're hesitant to do something substantial earlier in the season, whether it's beginning kind of the minutes management for veterans or making trades. Do you think this front office is committed to the point that, okay, if like the Jazz come out like absolutely on fire again or something, that they'll start making some decisions we would normally see in December, January, February before then?
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see, because, this front office typically doesn't make drastic roster decisions until February. There are some exceptions. In 2019, there was the Jordan Clarkson trade for Dante Exum, and that changed the Jazz quite a bit. Also in 2019, they cut Jeff Green pretty much in the middle of a road trip. So, that was an exception. But, on the norm, mostly on the norm, they take the first few months and then they assess and then they kind of go from there. In the last two seasons, they kind of pulled the plug around the All-Star break and that was it. March was, just kind of, hey, we're just going to lose as much as possible. And, but I mean, the thing that stands out to me is that, even deep into their roster, I mean, there are a lot of guys that this team wants to develop. And I think that that's atypical from where we were last year in the year before, right? So let's say you're sitting your regulars, right? And, even at the end of the roster, you want to develop Kyle Filipowski, or you want to develop, or you want to see, how Bryce Sensabaugh, handles 35 minutes, or you want to see how Cody Williams handles 35 minutes. I think one of the things that will help the Jazz hustle in reverse is, you play Cody Williams a lot of minutes, even with the regular rotation. You play Isaiah Collier a lot of minutes. And I think Isaiah Collier right now, if the season started today, and it won't start today, but it will start in 96 hours, or 120 hours, that, he would be the primary backup point guard. So, it's going to be really interesting to see, how the Jazz mesh their veterans versus how they bring along and develop their young guys. How many minutes does Jordan Clarkson play from night to night? How many minutes does John Collins play from night to night, even though he's probably not going to start to at least to begin the season? So how does all of that stuff work?
What is the biggest Wizards storyline that you are going to be tracking most closely into this season and throughout it, of course?
Hashtag capture the flag. Like, that's what we got to do this year here. We got to beat out Brooklyn or whoever else wants to be real bad. Like, that's what this entire season is about for the Wizards. Is they've got some like nice developmental pieces. Like, I'm higher than Koulibaly, higher on him than most, I would say, probably at this point. And Sarr, like, whatever you take from Summer League, let's say you take nothing from it, he still like is a guy you look at as like, oh, this is a future like star of the franchise. Like, I don't know. I think the ceiling is probably like pretty good starter and versatile guy that every winning team needs. Like, that's great. Is Bub, the next Baron Davis or somebody? Like, I don't know what the ceiling is for someone like him, but probably not to me. I think he's like another really nice piece. So I think this upcoming draft is like the one you have to star hunt in. Like, whoever you can get, wherever you can get it in the draft, whoever has like the most star potential of any of them, swing as big as you can. Because they don't have that guy yet to me. So that's what I'd be using this draft for. So you just can't afford to have like 25 wins this year and end up with a 7th pick or something like that.
How do you view it, though, through the lens of we're now in year, what I feels like, I don't know, at least year 5, right, of the flattened lottery odds? Does that impact your view at all of the value of being like, okay, you can be a bottom 4 team.
Sure.
And there's pretty clear pathway to do that because 14 of the teams in the West aren't currently trying to lose.
Yep.
But like, it feels like there's almost a trade-off where it's like, well, what cost do you need to do that? Because a 14% chance isn't all that much. And then you have 3 other teams that have the same chance of getting it. So you're always more likely not to get the number 1 overall pick, which was true beforehand, but those odds have been substantially shortened over the past half decade or whatever it is.
Like, I think Cooper Flagg will be a really good player just from what I've seen, but I think there's some other good pieces in this. So it's just lock yourself into like a top 5 pick. That's the move. If you can get the number 1 pick, great. But can you get VJ Edgecombe at 5 or one of those kind of guys? Like, that might be enough, or Ace Bailey or whoever you decide, Dylan Harper, like whoever the next couple guys are for you come draft night. Like, they've just got to do that one right and kind of hit big on it, I think, regardless of position or fit or any of those kinds of things. And like, I get like from the odds perspective, like it's not as important to be the absolute worst team anymore, but you've just got to ensure that you're in that like tier of bottom couple of teams no matter what.
And I think what you just said is that it's not even just the perfect way. It was perfect, but it's the only way to look at it if you're going to go that route. Is it's not just, yeah, it'd be great to get the number 1 pick, but it's we want to lock ourselves into the top 5 or whatever it is. And that makes more sense then because it's we're prepared to not have the number 1, the number 2 pick when it happens.
Yeah, like your chances of getting up to number 1, you know, they are what they are, but like I'd much rather be, you know, 2 and fall to 4 than 7 and hope I can get up to 1 or something like that.